start yet. The IT guys got to get done.
Alrighty, good evening. Welcome to the August 8th meeting of the City Council. I have the honor of chairing for the mayor tonight, who is on a much-deserved family vacation. This is our last meeting before August recess, so we do have quite a heavy agenda, so I want to thank my colleagues in advance for that. I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask you all to rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Conley,
Here.
Mr. Duncan,
Here?
Vice Mayor Hardy,
Here.
Ms. Leon,
Here.
Ms. Shantz Hiscott,
Here.
and Mr. Snyder and Mayor Tarter are on travel this evening. Mr. Snyder wanted us to know that he's working on some of the climate change issues that are coming to the forefront right now.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to adopt the meeting agenda. Do I have a motion, please?
Ms. Vice Mayor, I move to adopt the meeting agenda.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposes or abstentions? Ayes have it. So moving on to proclamations and special presentations. Madam Clerk, do we have any of those tonight?
We don't.
Okay. And any oaths of office for board and commission members in the audience?
No, there are not. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's move on to receipt of public comment. Madam Clerk, would you be able to summarize the written comments we've received?
Yes. Andrew Olison of Bike Falls Church asked that staff complete data gathering and receive public input on options for bike facilities as required by the Bicycle Master Plan when reviewing the site plan for Founders Row 2. Sean Dakin of 124 Whittier Circle provided information about speed camera use in New York City. Jenna Schroeder of 122 Westmoreland Street wrote with concerns about traffic and parking at Westmoreland and Lee Highway. Ryan Okowitz of 455 Tinner Hill wrote with concerns about an AT&T telecommunications outage that residents and businesses in Tinner Hill have been experienced, and requested a discussion of creating a city government administrator role to ensure consumer rights and protections in regard to telecommunications service providers. Edmund Young wrote with concerns about noise from two businesses near Westmoreland Street and Lee Highway. Erin Flynn of Little Falls Street asked for more public input opportunities for the Park Avenue Great Streets project and said she and her neighbors didn't know about the project prior to the recent walking tour. The ESC also provided comments on the City Council's biennial work plan. And that was it.
Great. How about receipt of public comment? Do we have anyone in the audience? Have we received?
Yes, we have Justine Underhill of 513 Greenwich Street. If you'd like to join us up here.
Great, thank you. If you could state your name and address and limit to 3 minutes, please. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Justine, and I am at 513 Greenwich Street. I recently bought a home in Falls Church, and we've been really loving this community. And this is a place that we hope we will be able to raise a family in, and that will be part of the next generation of Falls Church. I'm here to ask the City Council to be forward-thinking as we plan streets like Park Avenue, rather than maintain the status quo. Maintaining the status quo means dedicating 50% of our downtowns to cars and parking. Downtowns of the future will prioritize pedestrians and bikers, including areas that are biking and walking only. A 5-year-old walking or biking down a Sharrow on Park Avenue will not be protected from an SUV or car that tries to swerve around it. So I'm asking the City Council to please consider putting in a protected bike lane on Park Avenue as we move forward with that project. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Madam Clerk, do we have others?
No, we don't.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the next item then. We have the annual report from the library board. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Carroll.
Sure. Will this beep at me? Okay. Good evening, Vice Mayor Hardy and council members. Before I get started, we did hold our annual meeting last month, and we elected a new chair and vice chair. So our new chair is Jeff Peterson, who's with us here tonight, and our new vice chair is Christy Swinney, who I think is joining us watching online. So this report covers FY22 from July 2021 to June 2022. It seems like it was just yesterday, but we did kick off the year with moving from the temporary location in the trailer next to Oak Street and moving into the new building. In September, we had our grand opening to the public. The building is LEED Silver and ADA compliant. We increased our public spaces, including the new conference rooms and group study rooms, both very popular, and more bathrooms and space for the collection. We had several new initiatives that started in fiscal year 2022, including strategic planning. We engaged our consultant, our new library website, which will be online September 6th. And we also engaged a new collection development tool that will also improve our collection diversity as well. And we just had a kickoff meeting today for that. So we increased our in-person use of the library, of course. So the circulation of physical materials has increased. We've had participation in programming from children, teens, and adults. And we have more self-service options, including MeScan, that can be used on the self-checkouts, or you can use it on your very own cell phone. We are, again, a 4-star library in 2021, the calendar year, and that was based on FY19 data. And we have appeared on the list for the last 13 years now. Also this year, Claudia Gutierrez, our Senior Administrative Assistant, received the 2nd annual Chet DeLong Service Award in honor of Chet DeLong and his many years of service to the library and Library Foundation. So I would like to thank all of the library staff for their dedication and hard work this year. They are what makes the library a star library. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Questions from council? Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Ms. Vice Mayor. Congratulations on an excellent
Thank you.
year, Ms. Jenny. Could I ask the question that I've raised here a couple of times, and perhaps the manager might want to chime in too, about operating hours, of which there was a readjustment at some point in the past year. And I wonder what you've encountered since then in terms of public response, public need, and what the prospects are going forward for keeping the library open later on Sundays, I think, is the time that I read most folks who have thoughts on this say that they would like to see the library open.
So we have received a couple of comments that were sent to City Council. By far, in person, what staff is reporting to me that people are happy with the consistent opening at 10 a.m. So we will maintain the hours as they are right now. The plan and the goal is to increase hours as we are able to with budget and staffing. So as we're able to add hours, we will add them to Saturday and Sunday. So eventually increasing the hours from 10 to 3 to 10 to 5 on both days.
All right, thank you. I assume that there's a dollar figure attached to the cost to do that, and that the people who need to know that figure know it and know what our prospects are for being able to provide it in order to keep those hours extended from 3 to 5, as you said.
Other questions?
And Council, I'll just jump in. We did discuss this during the budget approval process, and if there are any updated numbers on that, we could bring those to the City Council. But I think after reviewing the pros and cons and the competing needs for dollars, the decision was to maintain the hours as they are right now, but we can revisit it in the future as we go forward, as our library director noted.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear about the strategic plan and the timing for when we can start to hear how that is shaping out to be. Is there an intention to start releasing thoughts on that? Are you getting community input first? Maybe talk about the process.
Sure. So we just, like I said, we just engaged the consultant. So currently, we're developing a survey that will be released in a variety of places. And then we will have community meetings starting in October. And then we will have a strategic retreat in November. And then the plan is to bring forward the strategic plan to the library board in February, March of 2023, with a final product in March, April. We're currently on schedule, so I expect all of those things to happen at the times that I stated. And then I think we'd probably bring it to council, too. And, of course, engage council throughout the process as well, and the library board.
That's exciting. Thank you.
Sure.
Mrs. Scott?
Thank you, and thanks to the library board and to the new volunteers who are stepping up to provide service as well. Maybe I've missed this, but I kind of joined in the last bit of the project management stage when I came onto council as part of the city oversight for the project, and I don't think we ever had our final wrap-up meeting that I recall. Are we still? I think that was last fall's calendar, and it slipped. I just know that we didn't quite tick and tie that. Are we just beyond that?
No, we
Or-
want to do it. So I think September is our target date where our project manager, there still have been punch list items and closeout items, so the books are not fully closed. I think they will be fully closed this month of August. And so we understand it's a piece of unfinished business. The project did come in under budget. That's unchanged, and so we want to report out those numbers and also just have a discussion about the things went well in this project, the things that we learn from every project. This one we widely view as having been very successfully run, but there's still always opportunities of things we can learn from every project, and we'll discuss those as well.
Yeah, just thinking to the extent that informs things you decide on for the strategic planning and moving forward with additional capital needs or operating needs too. So, thank you.
Ms. Connolly?
Ms. Heath, could we invite the volunteers who served on that board to be invited to the volunteer appreciation picnic?
Sure.
There was one community member, Howard Reel. Could we invite him to
Oh,
that picnic?
you mean the library construction
The
oversight?
Construction
Committee.
Oversight
Okay.
Committee. He
Okay.
probably wasn't on your list because that was the sundown committee, but
Yeah.
he definitely provided a lot, so if you could invite him, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure.
Actually, I think there were a couple people. I can get you the list. Okay. Okay.
Other questions from council? Okay. Just a quick one for me. So thank you, Ms. Carroll, and staff and the library board. Congratulations, Mr. Peterson, on assuming chair for keeping the library such a gem in our community. I love that you guys have been on the forefront of the equity work with the fee elimination policy. I think it was back in 2020 now. And so seeing that you're going to continue with improving collection diversity is great. So keep that up.
Yes.
I also agree with Ms. Hiscott on making sure we do that best practice of closing out, I think hopefully within a year, because I think September 2021 is when we open library doors. So let's do that within the year so we don't let a whole calendar year pass. But other than that, thank you for your hard work this year.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, one more.
I just had one additional question on the, I'm super interested in the self-service, convenience, being able to check out your own books with their
Sure.
phone or anything. Do you have, I imagine we'll probably need to collect some data on, like, does that help with staffing? And if it helps with staffing, does it help us allow us to keep the library open later, perhaps? Or, depending on how quickly people adjust to checking themselves out. I know students are pretty good at that. You just need to teach their parents how to do it too. But so look forward to seeing how that impacts staffing needs, or
Sure.
if it helps it at all. Because I think that's a great innovation and pretty exciting.
Okay.
Mr. Duncan?
Debbie reminded me of something else. Ms. Carroll, there was some talk we were going to do a cornerstone ceremony at some point in the fall. Dedication stone, plaque, something that
Oh, a
indicates-
dedication plaque.
There we go. Thank you. Right words.
I think it coincided with the resurgence of COVID
Mm-hmm.
last year, so certainly we can look into a dedication ceremony.
Okay. I just
Moving
want
forward.
to make sure that I inform my father-in-law because he'll definitely want to be there for that.
Of course.
Thank you.
And he actually just did an oral history with us, which was wonderful. So, yeah,
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us.
thank you so much.
Okay, moving on to council requests. Do we have any requests from the dais? Caroline, Ms. Leon.
Mr. Shields, in response, we've had a great turnout for the Park Avenue walking tour. Can you talk and share thoughts for how we're going to publish the comments and questions coming out of that and the answers, the process for getting back to the community and opportunities for additional input for folks that couldn't make it?
I was planning to speak to that during the manager's report, so I'm happy to do
Okay, will
that.
do. I'll wait.
Other requests?
My two requests are in the budget bin, I think. Things that I brought up at the beginning of the summer, and now that this is our last meeting of the summer, I just want to circle back to them. One is the progress of the assessor and his work on the appeals of the assessments. There was a dollar figure, I think, associated with, changes in revenue based on possible adjustments of assessments. I just want to ask that we be informed if that number is about what we'd expected, higher or lower, sometime in the early fall, I guess, September when we come back. We're coming back on the 12th of September. So that's one. The second, in the sort of carryover vein, is relates to the Gresham signal. I believe the manager has said that he's going to advise that we commit $100,000, I think the figure was, to a new control box at the intersection of Gresham and North Washington. I would be very interested in that dollar amount, whatever it is, being included in the carryover budget that usually the CFO brings to us in the fall. So if there's any change in plans on that, if you could let us know. If the plan is that, let's discuss committing resources to it and getting started working on it. Those are the two items that I had on my. I did want to mention in response to Mr. Olafson's letter and to the comment here earlier tonight, the Planning Commission did take under advisement his letter when they were discussing the Founders Row 2 site plan at their meeting last Wednesday, and there was some discussion if anybody's interested in the bicycle and cycling elements of that project. There's a good bit of information in the application for the site plan, and there was some discussion of it at the Planning Commission meeting, so that is something that folks have taken on board and have dealt with. My other, I guess, thought, maybe this will come up in the manager's report, is the parking situation, Westmoreland and Lee Highway, specifically our ability to enforce the signs that we hope that we're going to put up. We've received continuing correspondence from folks on Westmoreland and want to make sure that we keep up momentum on that during the long summer recess. Thank you.
Other council requests? Okay. I had the same one on Park Avenue, so it sounds like, Mr. Shields, you're going to give us an update on that. I think it looks like our public commenter has left, but it sounds like in general, the community probably would like to understand what the next steps are and whether there's opportunities for further public input. So let's make sure we talk about that. And then one request, I think I've circulated over email. We do have a GovOps meeting planned on August 18th, and so I've circulated the agenda to council and to the city manager. I think one of the items that I like to make sure we cover is recruitment of the new city attorney. Ms. McCoskey had announced to us last week that she is retiring, so I want to take the opportunity to give her much deserved congratulations on that big milestone. Thank you for your service, and we will begin the search to fill those big shoes. So you've been at the helm of a really transformational number of years in the city, and so we appreciate all your leadership and work for the city.
Thank you. I've very much enjoyed working with all of you and with the staff and with the residents of the city, too.
It'll be a bittersweet process when we talk about it in GovOps in August, but I wanted to put that request out there and also make that news public. So if there are no more council requests, we can move on to the report of the city manager.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Hardy, members of council. I will touch on the walking tour, and I also would like to talk about the LED streetlight conversion program, and then I'll try to do a quick follow-up on some of the questions earlier tonight. I would like to start off by congratulating Carol on her announcement of impending retirement in October. We've been through a lot together, and we'll have opportunities to say more when we get closer to your retirement. But that is big news for the entire city staff, and I'm very grateful for all of the things you've done for us. So let me start with the Park Avenue walking tour, just to provide a little bit of a reflection back on some of the comments that we received, and then talk about next steps. I will just start by thanking everybody who showed up. We counted about 75 to 80 participants in this walking tour, which was tremendous. It's really great to have so many members of our community show up for this. And a lot of credit goes to OCOM and Ms. Redden and Ms. Finarelli for publicizing it, Celeste Heath, and outreach to boards and commissions. But also our local newspaper, the Falls Church News Press, covered it very extensively before the walking tour, and I think that helped with turnout as well. Al Astorga is our project manager for this, and he organized the walking tour, but then took sort of a back seat so he could really listen carefully to the comments. Meanwhile, Paul Stoddard our planning director, served as our lead facilitator to present information, but also to help facilitate all the feedback that we did get. We also had our consultants with Volkert Engineering there. They presented information, but they also were listening very carefully to some of the comments. So let me just hit some of the main themes that we did here. We had 3 stations during the walking tour. The first station was at the library. This project really is for undergrounding power, all the overhead power utility lines, and installing streetscape, pedestrian improvements, and also creating a bicycling boulevard to create a very safe space for cyclists, pedestrians, and vehicular traffic on Park Avenue from the library all the way to the State Theater. That's kind of the project mission and the project scope. So we had 3 stations. We met first at the library, and then at the corner of Little Falls and Park Avenue, and then last at the corner of at Maple Avenue and Park Avenue. And we discussed the features that we were in design phase at each of those stations. I will note also that we put paint markings down on the street so people could see how the pedestrian facilities would be built, the sort of the bump outs and the refuges for pedestrian safety, and those are still on the street for people to see right now. It eventually will go away because it's water-based paint. So some of the things we heard, first at the library station, there was a discussion of the materials that we use, concrete versus brick. There was discussion about making sure that whatever we use, it's not slippery and is safe. There was a discussion of the farmers market location, because there has been discussion about potentially bringing the farmers market out to Park Avenue and then opening up City Hall for parking. We have a lot of work to do to determine the feasibility of that. Obviously, that would involve closing the street on Saturdays. We did hear from a number of the businesses nearby that they were concerned about a restriction on traffic like that. In addition, the business owners at some of the office buildings along Park Avenue were concerned about access to their office building. And so those were some of the comments heard at at the library station. At City Hall, there was a discussion of user safety and the need for designs that make kids and their parents feel safe traveling alone. There was a note that at the Little Falls and Park Avenue, currently we're talking about getting rid of that signal and having that intersection be a four-way stop sign. There was discussion about design and ADA access for a raised crossing. There was discussion about the ongoing maintenance costs of streetscape and the other features of this plan, and noting that the federal grant will cover the construction, but it will be up to us locally, the taxpayers, to maintain it over time. There's a discussion of lighting. There's a discussion about spillover. If we're successful in sort of taming the speeding on Park Avenue, will that cause people to not drive on Park Avenue and be diverted to other streets? There was a desire for more information potentially about that, and if so, improvements in traffic calming on other streets. And then lastly, at Northside Social, there was a discussion of on-street parking. The business community, representatives of the business community noted the importance of maintaining on-street parking for business support. There was a discussion about the undergrounding of utilities, a welcome thing, but also a very intensive construction activity that has big impacts for all the surrounding businesses as they go through having their service go underground as opposed to above ground where it's getting to their buildings today. There was a question about intersection design. Can trucks make the turns with the bulb outs that were painted on the streets that people could see very clearly? There's a discussion about bike connections, how this project can connect to the WNOD, as it currently does with Sharrows all the way down Park Avenue and on Great Falls to connect up with the WNOD. There was discussion about safety and concern about drivers getting in crashes today, driving too fast, and some of which are distracted. And then lastly, just in terms of our notes, talking about speed and potentially using speed tables or speed humps on North Maple near the entrance to Park Towers to slow traffic coming over the hill. This is just a kind of a representative sampling of some of the comments that we've had, that we have received. We are putting these into a document. It's just part of the document files. Now, in terms of next steps, where we are right now is we're past 30% design and we're moving towards 60% design. What's important about 60% design is you submit that to VDOT, and that's where you set your right-of-way. So at 60% is if you need additional right-of-way for some of the features, that's where you communicate that in your plans to VDOT, and they allow you to use money for those purposes. So that's the important milestone at 60% that council and the public should be aware of. We do intend to have additional outreach to the public, partly to follow up on these questions, but also as plans are finalized or getting closer to final to let people see those and comment on those. I will state that our takeaway from this meeting was support for the bike boulevard concept, and so we are proceeding with plans at 60% on that basis. And I'll stop the report there, and happy to take any questions or comment on that. The next item that I plan to report on is on our LED streetlight conversion. So maybe before I get into that, let me pause there to see if there's any questions or comments on what I just reported on the Park Avenue tour.
Great, Ms. Leon.
Thank you for that. Is there a way for citizens who missed that walking tour to provide additional feedback or to, to interface with Al or staff to have a conversation on what they missed? I think I've heard that a couple times, or more than a couple of times from citizens.
So I would say this, one, as part of the preparation for this walking tour, we did update the city's website coverage of this project. So I think pretty good information is accessible to the public about the project on the city's website. If you just go to the homepage and look under projects, it'll be listed right there. We are still getting feedback, and so people who attended this meeting or maybe who didn't, who want to get their comments in, we welcome those, and those emails are still coming in directly to Al. On the city's web page for the Park Avenue project, there is contact information so people can know who to send comments into.
Does it make sense to actually host another public forum as we're at 30%? So maybe when we get to 45 or 50, on the path to 60, what are you thinking about that as an option?
Well, we're kind of probably already there.
Okay.
The 30% submission was like a month and a half ago or so. So I think probably 60% is a good checking in point.
Okay.
And so I'll talk about that with staff about how we could do that effectively.
Okay, I think there'd be a great appreciation if we could do that. Thanks.
Other questions about Park Avenue from Mr. Shields? Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. So I'm always one to see possibilities, not problems, as you know. But since you brought up there at the very tail end, the Bike Boulevard concept, I'm hearing that out of this year, and then out of this year, I'm hearing the person who spoke to us earlier tonight refer to her vision as a protected bike situation. And I'm just curious if you can say anything further about what we learned from the walking tour, or where we are in terms of, merging the safety of pedestrians, especially, which requires bump outs and things that we, are familiar with, and this Bike Boulevard concept, which cuts into some of the space, I think, that's dedicated now, not just to motor vehicles, but also to potentially to pedestrian safety measures. Did we learn anything, get any further along on resolving that? Since the mayor's not here, I should just add the whole right-of-way question, which you also brought up. Did we learn from the walking tour that we pretty well maxed out what we can do in the way of right-of-way, or is there more ground that we can gain in order to accomplish some of these goals, which are, if not conflicting, or at least competing?
So, one of the reasons we were very pleased to have such a good, broad turnout for this walking tour is that we really wanted to hear from as many voices as possible, because we have been hearing from people about this question of having protected bike lanes or dedicated bike lanes on Park Avenue. So the consequences, sort of the trade-offs with that would either be condemning property for additional right-of-way, and particularly when you get closer, on the east side of Little Falls Street, that becomes very difficult to do because we did have markers out there showing the limits of right-of-way right now, and it's essentially 6 inches behind the sidewalk. So we're using the full right-of-way right now. And so the way the street was envisioned, I think, with the Great Streets program from the beginning, with the support of the Planning Commission and kind of a planning process that we started at the beginning, was a really vibrant, mixed-use street where vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists all operate together and safely in the same space. So that has been the planning construct that we've been moving on. If we do go towards dedicated bike lanes, one of the features is that the street will feel much more open. It'll feel much bigger, and that will drive up vehicle speeds. That's just what happens when you open streets up. And so that has been a trade-off that in the planning process we've thought is probably not a good trade-off for the way that street functions. It's a very lively, multi-use street, lots of commercial activity, lots of park users coming and going, crossing the street. That's part of what creates the safe conditions on the street today. And so our thinking has been, let's build on that, let's enhance that further, and go with that character, that existing character of the street, and make it even better than it is today. That's kind of the pitch for the multi-use approach that we have. It's not a finished question, but that is where we've been at the 30% plan, and I am signaling that based on the input that we've gotten so far, that is the direction we would be heading in for the 60% plans as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you, and well said. Anybody is interested in this topic, I suggest you roll the tape back to 8 o'clock this meeting and listen to the 5 minutes that we just listened to, because I think it's relevant not only to Park Avenue, but to other streets in the city. One final point was brought up by one person who was at the walking tour. Cherry Hill Park, Cherry Hill, the farmhouse, is obviously a great community asset. It sort of sits above and a little remote from the street on which it is because of just the way the terrain works. At any rate, as we are making improvements, this person suggested that we keep in mind the visibility and accessibility of Cherry Hill Farmhouse should be a factor. And since you didn't happen to mention that in your earlier presentation, I just wanted to put that in as a comment that I heard in the background from somebody who's been very involved in historic preservation here in the city. Thank you.
Other questions or comments from Mr. Shields on Park Avenue? Okay, I have a few. So I agree with Ms. Leon's request to kind of make sure we kind of update the community on a lot of the points that you summarized for us, which I thought was very comprehensive. I think one of the hallmarks of doing good public engagement is when people feel heard. So getting that replay back of here are the comments we heard, here's what we're doing about it, that kind of completes the circle for public engagement. So I want to make sure that happens. And I'm looking at Ms. Redden, perhaps from OCOM, could help us with that this week to say, hey, we had great turnout for people who missed it. Here are the comments we heard. Here's the next steps. Here's when you can expect 60% design. Here's how you can engage further and give us further comments, because we do want to keep up that good momentum we've built around good engagement. On the point about, I guess, bike lanes. So I'm hearing that this bike boulevard concept won't be a dedicated bike lane. I think this is a good opportunity for us to think about alternative streets that might lead to the WNOD that would be good candidates for a dedicated bike lane. So Great Falls or Little Falls, I think, has been discussed since those lead to the WNOD. And so I'm not sure where that is on our plan other than it being on the master bike plan that needs to be updated this fall. But that might be a good kind of corollary, saying that, hey, we hear you. If we can't fit it in on Park Avenue, these are alternative streets that we're considering as a follow-up to our bike advocates. But again, kudos and really good collaboration for city staff. So thank you for all the hard work on that one and all the publicity. I think all that hard work was really evident by the turnout we saw. So thank you. Moving on to your LED streetlight update, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have a graphic for this, which might be a little bit hard to see. Thank you, Cindy. Cindy zoomed in. So, so the City Council approved in the CIP funding for the conversion of our existing sodium vapor streetlights to LED. And some of the reasons to do that include very significant energy savings. LED uses a lot less energy. It also, as we know from our Smart Cities pilot program that we're working with Virginia Tech on, that LED over time can give us a bit more flexibility on how we light streets and adjusting the brightness or dimness based on time of day and other such things. In this program, we won't have that ability immediately, but we do know that technology is coming down in price, where the things we will buy may allow that in the future. So what we're announcing tonight is that we are starting the long-awaited pilot program for the LED lights. And the purpose of this is for people to go and see these lights in a residential context. And so they can kind of get a sense how bright they are, kind of what the color of them is. You can adjust that quite a bit. Some of them are kind of blue and light, and some of them, you know, by changing what they call the temperature, the Kelvin rating of the lighting, you can make it a little bit more on the yellow spectrum. So we'll have some variety, and people can see that and provide us comment on it. The areas where there will be is on Fulton Avenue between Pennsylvania and Oak Street. We'll have them on Gordon Road. That's kind of more of a commercial setting with the Cobra heads there between Route 7 and the property yard. We'll have them at James Court. James Court has a different light style, and so we want to show those off so people can see that in the Winter Hill neighborhood. And then lastly, our city park lighting. We'll have some examples at Cherry Hill Park as well. Wherever a pole has been converted to LED, and that's already happened, so you can go out tonight and take a look at them. But they'll have a pink band on the pole that you'll be able to see basically at street level, and then if you look up, you'll see that, that the light probably looks a little bit different from the other sodium vapors that you're used to seeing. What we're really looking for comment on is the brightness and the color of the lighting. I will note that the styles, the Acorn style and the Carlisle and the various ones that we use have gone through the Board and Commission comment process with the AAB, the Planning Commission, Environmental Services, Environmental Sustainability Council, and other groups. So we think those styles will stick with. We're really looking for feedback on brightness and color. This pilot will last through September 30th. And we'll have a good communications program to let people know about this and know how they can get feedback back to us over the coming weeks. After September 30th, the plan then is to work with Dominion Power, who owns all of these lights, and they will, in sort of batches of 50, then roll out LED conversions citywide. So with batches of 50, it'll take us about a year to convert the roughly 1,088 lights that are owned by Dominion. It'll take several months, probably about a year, for that to happen. And then lastly, I will note that our commercial districts, lights that are owned by the city, we converted those to LED about 5 years ago. So this is really now going into residential neighborhoods, and it's knowing the sensitivities of how people want to see their street lit. We want to have this pilot program so people can comment on it first. Any questions or comments on that?
Mr. Duncan?
Well, this is very exciting. I'm glad to see this rolling out. Going to what you said about the existing improvements that we've made, particularly in commercial areas, I just worry when we get to the point where there's lots of walking life on the street in Falls Church, which we're already getting in that direction, but certainly Founders Row and Founders 2 and downtown intersection at Broad and Washington, that the lighting for pedestrians and for motorists trying to see pedestrians is not very good. And it speaks to safety and other issues that we hear about the public complaining about. Do we feel like the existing lighting that we have at these key commercial intersections is done for good, or is that possibly a work in progress that we might upgrade those lights to make them brighter? I mean, I think they just need to be, our streets need to be better lit at key commercial intersections.
So I think it is evolving, and we can increase the brightness of LEDs. That is something that we can do. Some of our intersections are partially under construction, like our major one of Route 7 and Route 29, so that's going to be a pretty significant upgrade when that project is complete. But maybe we could, if people do have comments of particular areas that are too dark, share that, and we can go take a look at it.
Okay, well, I'm sharing that Broad and West is, when it gets to be what it wants to be, 5 years from now, is going to need much better lighting than it has right now in order to provide safe passage for folks going from one side of that intersection to the other in particular. Thanks.
Ms. Connolly?
Yeah, thanks for that information, Mr. Shields. Is there a plan to publicize this to the community as well, especially the residents who live nearby or others to comment? Is it just open comment, or is there a survey?
It's going to be a big campaign to let people know about it. There will be a survey vehicle so that it'll be easy to give feedback in, and so we'll be rolling that out, I think this week or early next week, and they'll be up, we'll be taking comment through the month of September. And
Okay. Just a thought that just popped into my head and could be completely impractical, but it would be cool to have a QR code on each pole so that as people come through and they see the pole, they can either comment directly or learn more about it. Thank you.
Great idea. Other comments or questions about LED streetlights? A related question, because I feel that this one before, is anytime you do improvements to residential streetlights, people will want more. Is there a way for people to ask for streetlights on their residential neighborhood?
That's a good question. We've been talking about that internally. I know there are a few spots where people have asked for more. The city standard is every third pole. And so it's, we also get lots of comments of people saying they don't want a light right in front of their house. And so that standard has been important for us to say this is kind of the way it is, because we can't negotiate every light in the city, even though there are opinions about probably every light in the city. That's the standard where but we'll take comment on that as well.
Great, thank you. It's exciting development, so thank you for that update. Anything else from your report, Mr. Shields?
Just real quickly on West Westmoreland, we are still working with that neighborhood on parking, and I think we do have some good solutions that we're working on there. We are also working on zoning enforcement for some of the auto-related uses along that corridor, and I think that's also very closely associated with some of the concerns that the neighbors have. But more to come on that.
Great, thank you. If there's nothing else from the city manager, let's move on to business on the agenda. Madam Clerk, will you call the first item, please?
Yes. We have TR 22-36, resolution to adopt an economic development agreement between the City of Falls Church, Virginia, the City of Falls Church Economic Development Authority, and Founders Row Holdings, LLC.
Great. Mr. Shields, are you taking this one, or is there Mr. Fuller?
I will take this one, and maybe what we'll do tonight is the reverse of the way we did it with Economic Development Authority last week. I'll provide just very brief introductory comments, then we'll let Mr. Muffler speak to the need, the request for this economic development agreement, and then I will come in just to provide some additional detail and some other context from the city's perspective on this proposed agreement. Just by way of introduction, what this agreement is intended to do is to provide an economic incentive for the theater component to Founders Row 1. Back in 2015, the City Council considered an economic development incentive for the theater. It had a 5-year sunset on it. The Founders Row development team of Mill Creek had a movie theater under lease and were planning to deliver on that. And then with the COVID pandemic, that company was not able to perform and they abandoned their lease. Mill Creek has worked very hard, and we've been the reason I know that is we've been in pretty close contact with them as they've recruited a movie theater tenant for this space. And as they did so, they came back to the city to request that agreement, which had been sunsetted and had expired, be renewed. And in addition, they asked for an expansion to increase the incentive amount, given the increasingly difficult economics of the theater lease in terms of the overall project. So that is a little bit of background. I will turn it over to Mr. Muffler to walk through the details of the term sheet, essentially, of what's being asked for. And then we can circle back, and I'll touch base on a couple of other considerations for the city. Just in terms of the request tonight, the EDA has taken a look at this and taken basically an informal vote in favor of proceeding with consideration of this agreement. The request of council tonight is to refer this formally to the EDA. They would then take it up at their meeting on September 6th. And then the other request of the City Council is to schedule final consideration of this at your meeting on September 12th. So let me stop there, and I think Mr. Muffler is on the call, and he can walk through the agreement from his perspective, and then we'll circle back. And I think he might start with information on the retail lease-up for the overall project, just to provide a bit of additional context of what's happening for the commercial components of the project as a whole. Good evening, Mr. Muffler. Thank you for being with us tonight. And Mr. Muffley, you might be muted.
You're showing not muted, but we're not hearing you. Still not hearing you, so you might need to check your microphone setting.
Cindy, he's showing up on the closed captioning
Yep.
that it's being picked up somewhere, but not in the room.
So what we might do while we try to work through that technical issue, then I will take the opportunity to just walk through at a high level the terms that are before the City Council, and then hopefully we'll get the audio figured out for those who are calling into this meeting. So the Economic Development Incentive Agreement, as presented before Council tonight, has two components to it. Both of them are associated with consumer taxes that would be paid by users of the theater. And there's a relationship between those taxes that are collected and the incentive that would be provided back to the developer to help them cover some of the build-out costs and some of the expenses they've incurred in bringing this particular tenant as an anchor to the overall commercial program for Founders Row. So the first component is what was contemplated back in 2015 when this was first considered, and that is an incentive that takes a portion of the admission tax payments that would be paid by people who buy tickets to see movies at this theater and returned to the developer, and that would be such that the first $20,000 would be paid and kept by the City of Falls Church, and then the amount between $20,000 and $360,000 would be then returned to the developer on an annual basis through a grant from the Economic Development Authority. So the value to the developer of that incentive is $340,000 per year. The new component to the incentive is associated with meals tax payments that would be collected from the restaurant portion of the theater, not from any other restaurants anywhere else in the project, but only those associated with the theater itself. That component, the first $10,000 of meals taxes would be retained by the city, and then between $10,000 and $160,000 would be retained by or be returned, similar to the admissions tax, to the developer. So that's a $150,000 potential benefit or incentive for the developer. So taken in total, 340 plus 150, this is a $490,000 annual subsidy for this use. Again, all from consumer taxes that would be paid by users of this theater. Because one other feature of the request in 2015, this was a 20-year term agreement, and what is being requested now is a 30-year term agreement. There is a provision where if the theater is doing very well and if it is grossing $13 million per year, then the meals tax component of this program would be suspended for that year. And if the theater were to perform at that level 4 years in a row, then the meals tax provision of this incentive would be ended, and the agreement as a whole would revert back to a 20-year agreement as opposed to a 30-year agreement. The city has put in there conditions for performance, and those include that the developer will have, by September 30th, executed a lease with the theater operator, and that's September 30th of this year, 2022. By the end of this calendar year, by December 31st, 2022, building permits for the theater tenant improvements will have been submitted, and then by the end of the year 2023, the theater would be open for business. If those conditions aren't met, then the agreement would be ended. There is a provision that would allow the city to make the decision as to whether the agreement would be ended and by notice to the developer. In other words, I think there's some flexibility that if we were very close or the developer was very close, then the city would be inclined to give a small extension. Those are, I think, some of the key terms. I will note that in addition to this agreement, there are provisions in the voluntary concessions related to the theater that the City Council has asked for in the past. And one is that the developer has placed into a joint account, an escrow account with the city in the amount of $3.6 million that is reserved for tenant improvements for the theater build-out. There are performance conditions under which spell out how those funds can be released as construction on the theater build-out proceeds. In addition, the developer has agreed to hold back 16 residential certificates of occupancy pending the execution of a lease with the theater operator. I think that is a summary of the program. I'm not sure if we have audio yet to hear from Mr. Muffler.
Well,
And if-
Mr. Muffler logged out, logged back in, so if we could have Joe do a test, please. And I'm not hearing Mr. Muffler. Mr. Fuller, could you do a test so we can see if it's everybody on Teams? And I'm not hearing Mr. Fuller. Joe, are you hearing Mr. Fuller? Okay, so we're having a difficulty here. If you give us a moment, we have IT on the phone and gonna chat.
So while we're waiting for this audio issue to be resolved, let me see if council has any questions or direction for me as we wait for Mr. Muffler. Maybe I can ask the city attorney if she has anything to add to this. The city attorney has been working and converting the term sheet into the form of the agreement, the draft of which you have in your packet. But I don't know if the city attorney has anything that she would like to add as well.
I don't have anything to add at this point, but if there are questions, I can help try to answer.
Do we have questions from council while we wait?
I can always fill up dead space. That's my job. I'll start with just a general question, I guess, to the manager. So it was referred to an agreement that was made in 2015. That was 7 years ago. In materials presented by the applicant, there's language speaking to how the market has changed in that amount of time, and specifically in pandemic times, how the market has changed. Just generally, is your feeling that we have learned the hard way from the failure of Studio Movie Grill's efforts to put a theater in here, that the new candidate, Paragon, identified in the documents that we're looking at, is, of a caliber and of a reputation and of a track record that suggests that we can rely on these new milestones being hit and these new revenue figures being realistic?
So when this was developed over the winter months, the city council asked a lot of tough questions about this, and staff did as well. We did hire, we did have our outside financial advisor, both our commercial real estate advisor as well as we had Boundary Stone and we had Boland Smart take a look at this and provide some analysis and provide staff and council with some thoughts in terms of their visibility into the pro formas of this particular use and some of the difficulties that the industry as a whole have been having. I won't go into the details of that. A lot of that was based on documents were provided directly to the consultants that the city staff were not provided. Then we just relied on our consultants to share with us their visibility in terms of what the gap was. And so with that independent verification, the judgment of will be the council's as to whether this is an agreement we should enter into. In terms of the need of it, the consultants that were hired by the city to look out for the city's interest did indicate that there was clearly a need for it. And so then the decision is up to the city as to whether we would support to try to close the gap with an agreement such as this. The developer has certainly indicated that if this agreement is approved, that they intend to then execute the lease in the month of, essentially immediately thereafter.
Okay, thank you.
I think we
Go ahead and, if
have
the
the
audio's
audio.
working,
I think we have the audio
Okay,
fixed. If
great.
we could check with Mr. Muller.
Yes?
Yes.
Hello? All right.
Loud and clear.
Right.
Great.
This is Gary Fuller, testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, you're good, Gary.
Great, thank you.
Well, Wyatt, would you like me to take it from here?
Turn it over to you. Let me just circle back with Councilmember Duncan to if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think you did. Since we got Joe working, we want to hear from him. But I did want to ask, the dollar figure of cost associated with this agreement, did you say was $490,000 annually? Is that the estimate?
Yes, and so it's capped at that amount, and then it's in terms of what is provided to the developer is based on the performance of the theater. If they only get what are actually collected. I mean, there's that direct relationship, and it's specific to the theater. There's no other taxpayers that are impacted by this. This is strictly isolated to the economic impact of the theater. But the city would be then returning a significant or perhaps all of the admissions tax and meals tax dollars that otherwise would be coming to the city. So there's kind of the opportunity cost, if you look at it that way, from the city's perspective. The developer's point of view would be, and our own consultants confirm this, is that the flip side of the coin, there will not be a theater here if there's not an economic development incentive along these lines.
Okay. Just one other question. The scope of that dollar figure compared to the net fiscal impact of the entire project, we're giving up $490,000. The project as a whole, including, of course, the residential component too, I understand, but is roughly what? Can we remember what the fiscal impact numbers for this project predict it to be?
Yeah,
My
so
colleagues tell me that it's 1.7 to 2 million.
So the fiscal impact as modeled in 2018 when the city council approved this was the net fiscal impact was $1.7 million to $2 million of net fiscal impact after accounting for school costs and other public service costs associated with this project. So that already subtracted out admissions tax because we assumed we weren't going to get those in 2018. So what's new is the $150,000 of meals tax, which would no longer come to the city. So that's kind of probably the way to look at the net fiscal impact of this change relative to what we've presented in the past.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, it occurred to me one other question that in the documents, and others here have posed the question about, okay, sure, maybe the movie theater is taking a hit, but the residential component of your project is worth more than we imagined that it would be. Your rents are that you're commanding are higher. This is really a question for Mr. Muffler to address. I think that is a question that's been raised from the dais by others, and I'd like to hear him speak to that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to take that there, and thank you, Mr. Shields, for the summary thus far. You did a very good job of outlining and speaking to our position as well. So I don't have a ton more to add to that. As to the residential side of things, Councilmember Duncan, I can tell you that there's two ways of looking at this, right? We look at our rents, our residential rents, from 4 years ago when we closed on this, what we would call our untrended rents, right? And that was what we were getting in 2018. And the way the market has operated, right, is we grew a little bit and then we crashed during the pandemic, and now we've come back up in a V. We're slightly above that untrended target. So effectively where our rents were 4 years ago, we're doing slightly better than that. However, obviously when you do a deal like this, your belief is that your rents are going to grow like this, and maybe a little dip, but they're going to continue to grow. That would be your trended rents today. We aren't close to that. So the thought that residential has done so well as to overcome the additional economic burden of this theater transaction, you know, you can take my word for it or you can. I totally understand. But that's why we went through the rigorous analysis with the city's independent consultants, plural, was to verify that exact sentiment. Was can your residential float this? And there's two ways of looking. It's the rent side, and then it's also the valuation side, what we would say our cap rate is. So even if rents had continued to trend, the reality is because of what interest rates have done, because of where the market has gone, the premium that you get on an exit for your asset today is less than it was 6 months ago. It's less than it was 4 years ago, because of where the rate environment has gone. So there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. I could talk about it for a while, but what I would hang at least our hat on in this presentation is not my word, but again, the verification of the independent consultant who reviewed everything: residential rent rolls, retail rent rolls, theater rent rolls, costs, budgets, etc., and came up with the analysis that essentially said, yes, this request is justifiable, very similar to the way the request 7 years was. So hopefully that answers your question, but I'm happy to touch on it further. Anything else on that? Okay. Yes, there we go. Okay, so happy to touch on a few pieces. Mr. Shields already summarized the agreement as a whole, so why don't I just provide a brief update as to the retail leasing, since that's paramount here. Is this summarizes here, you know, we've effectively, and I'll be honest, this is now, I put this together last week, this is now slightly outdated, but the numbers are plus or minus, right, because we have executed an additional lease since then. But plus or minus, we have about 20% of our retail at lease, with an additional 46%, which includes the movie theater, that is very near lease. And to Mr. Shields' points, while there is slight more road to go, I would say we're at the 1 yard line with the theater lease, this agreement being the largest outstanding piece to that. So in total, those two categories, the 66% is about 53,000 square feet of retail that is at or very near lease. We are additionally under LOI, meaning we have signed a term sheet with an additional 9% of retail. That's about 7,200 square feet. And then the last remaining portion, as you can see here, the ones without logos, it's about 25% or 20,000 square feet. But within that, if you look at space 15 right there in the middle, that's about 10,000 square feet right there. So that one space incorporates about 50% of the marketed, you know, non-term sheet retail. That, as you may recall, was the restaurant that we had under contract that also abandoned their lease during the pandemic. We refer to that as our junior anchor, and it's very difficult to get a junior anchor without a senior anchor, which is the movie theater. So very candidly, our focus has been on executing the theater, managing the additional retail, which is not unsubstantial at this portion, at this piece. Then we can focus on the junior anchor along with some of the smaller shell retail spaces, as you'll see along Broad Street, you know, the 1,000, 1,200 square feet spaces. We do have a tremendous amount of interest in tenancy, and we're trying to balance all of that with the focus largely right now being on Paragon. The next two slides, which you can click through very, you know, briefly at your leisure, is a summary of the tenants that we do have. We will have 4 restaurants, we hope, open before the end of the year, with Chase and Tails, Role Play, and Nui open here in the next, we hope, 6 to 8 weeks. That would include storefronts installed for those. And Ellie Bird, which is the Michelin star restaurant, before the end of the year. I believe they are targeting around Thanksgiving, and they were pending supply chain, construction, et cetera. The next sheet, the next slide is longer term. We're talking more like first quarter of next year, but these are all executed leases with tenants who are in design and permitting or under construction. So that's a summary of the retail at Founders Row. There was a request at the EDA for a brief update on the residential occupancy. Our Modera community is about 70% occupied. They had the advantage of not only pre-leasing, but opening last September. Our Verso community, which did not open until May, is about 20% occupied. And as we've spoken about from the get-go, the Verso community is the age-restricted community. That will be a much slower lease-up than a traditional apartment community. That's just the nature of the beast with that kind of residential community. But both are making good progress from occupancy. I've already spoken about rents. We're very proud of the community that's been built. We're very excited to see where everything continues to progress on the retail side. Couple of other notes on the fiscal. Actually, there's a couple of things that were brought up, and I'm sorry I'm going out of order now because they've already been touched on to some capacity. Speaking about the theater operator itself, we spoke about this at the EDA. I've spoken about this in private and in public. Coming out of COVID, with the failure of Studio Movie Grill, our first and foremost intent with negotiating with theaters was to find the best operators possible for the exact reason you mentioned there, Mr. Duncan. They didn't have to be the flashiest theaters. They didn't have to be the most expensive theaters, right? They needed to be the best operators possible. We believe we have found that group. You ask, how can you be sure? You've had the independent audits. City staff has been kept apprised. What I would tell you is maybe the best way of measuring our view of their operating ability is that we are going to be spending an amount of money that frankly is, I don't mind saying it's in the 8 figures to put this tenant in place. And that again speaks to the economics of why we're here with the ask on the economic development agreement. But I would encourage this theater operator did just open up a brand new theater in outside of Raleigh in Cary, North Carolina, that has been immensely successful in the month it's been open, and it looks beautiful. So we think we have gotten a very good operator that also has a very good product for a reason, which is why we are here today on the goal line of trying to execute this. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, and Ross Lichtenhouse did bring this up on the EDA agreement, this is somewhat of a unicorn deal. There are not many new theaters getting done, not just locally, but across the country. It is an industry that is still very much cautious and emerging. God bless Tom Cruise and everyone behind Top Gun 2 for proving that the movie theaters are a going concern and are a sustainable business model. But we are not back to pre-pandemic levels of operation here. So it's not like we can stand here today and say everything's back to normal, everything's good. There's still caution in the marketplace. There are very limited operators looking at new developments. But we are very comfortable and confident with the group that we have found here. Touching on the fiscal impact, one point there that I did discuss with Becky is I do think that and this actually dovetails what we're going to talk about next, which is some of the modifications to the VCs. This does have a lower seat count than the original theater. The main reason, than Studio Movie Grill, the main reason for that is that, and one less theater as well, and Becky has noted it here, it's because we will be including an IMAX style premium large format screen here. So just the general layout of that, plus the layout of the new theaters. I've been to the Paragon theaters. They're simply more luxurious than Studio Movie Grill. Wider seats, more comfortable seats. They have these VIP sections that are really nice. It's just a more boutique, different environment, hence the fewer seats. However, with that comes 2 things. One, higher ticket prices, but not astronomically so. We're projecting $12 ticket prices, which I think anyone that's gone to a movie here recently would say that's probably conservative from a fiscal impact. And 2, so you've got the pricing, and 2 is what you find in these boutique theaters that are great operators, you get greater capacity utilization of your theaters, meaning more people per showing show up because it's a better experience overall. So net, if you were to compare the Studio Movie Grill pro forma from 4 years ago when we revised the VCs and the fiscal impact versus the new theater economic state, even with fewer seats, ironically, you end up just about even on the fiscal impact. Now, granted, Studio Movie Grill's ticket prices are probably a little bit more, but the point being, the overall fiscal impact should not be dramatically impacted if this theater performs the way we think it could, maybe even a little bit better if it does more and so in the 375,000 to 400,000 tickets that the former theater thought. The last piece that I'd like to touch on before I wrap up here is there was in this 3 additional requests that are in the agreement that I don't believe Mr. Shields touched on. I'd like to summarize those very briefly just to be proactive in it. One, very straightforward, and I think it's very understandable. We are asking for proration language within the document, meaning if the theater does not open up on the first day of the fiscal year, if it opens up on the second day of the fiscal year or the 4th month of the fiscal year, that we still receive a tax benefit from that. That this agreement still goes into place, but that it's prorated, meaning the caps get prorated so nothing is out of whack. I think that's very straightforward and understandable, that there shouldn't be a penalization, if you will, for opening up the theater whenever it just happens to open up. The second piece here that we are requesting is a portion of this agreement that if the city in the future, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, chooses to increase the amount of the admissions tax, which I believe is controlled at the state level, the state would have to raise it above 10%. If council decided to do that, that there would be a quote unquote true up within this document so that the percentages of the distributions continue to align. If the city were to go from 10% to 15%, your ability to make more money may be better. It does come at the harm of the theater and comes at the harm of the ownership of the theater as well. So we would just ask that those percentages slide up so that the caps are adjusted accordingly. And then certainly anything above the cap, which would be greater, would go to the city. And then the last thing are time adjustments to the performance milestones. When we did this and we spoke about this, it was back in March. It was done with best guesses and best projections of how this process could play out. This has taken a little bit longer than expected. We are anticipating signing the lease shortly after we are able to complete this agreement. However, I can tell you standing here today, we are going to need a few more months to get building permit applications submitted just based on where we are today. So these dates are reflective of what we thought was potentially achievable in March. And rather than sit here today and tell you, I can hit these dates, I'm not confident that we could. So I am asking for a slight adjustment in that just so that we come out of this all on the same page, all working towards the same goal. And that's where I'm going to wrap up, is talking about the same goal. It's what I said back in March, and so what I'm going to say today. This is not a tax abatement, right? This is a tax sharing that is based on the performance of the theater. Our entire agreement with the theater, frankly, is based on the performance of the theater, based on how our rent structure is right now. The only way we do well, both with the agreement and with the theater, is if the theater performs. So we're effectively putting our money where our mouth is here. We think that that creates a win-win situation, not only for council, not only for the ownership, but for the general public as well, to have true alignment in our goals to make sure that this is a successful theater. And to that end, there have been conversations about potentially having additional work done at phase 1 to have this agreement passed. We want nothing more than to see this project be successful, given the incredible amount of investment financially and time that we put into this. Personally, I think you all know me at this point, and you know how successful I would like this to be. I would just ask that in these conversations that we take this agreement for what it is. It's the necessary means to an end to effectuate a successful theater into place, and to not burden this with additional overlays that could make this more difficult to put into place. Trust me, we are going to do everything we can to try to make that project successful. In 2015, it was determined that this was a reasonable request. The world has turned upside down with movie theaters. Independent consultants have verified that the economics are as lopsided as we have presented. I still feel like this is a reasonable request. I sincerely appreciate your time, and I'm happy to talk through any additional questions, comments, thoughts that you may have on this at this point. Thank you.
On line item 67, either Mr. Muffler or Mr. Shields, when we talk about, we're referencing release from the joint escrow account based on hitting construction milestones. Can you provide more specificity as to what you exactly mean when you say
Yes.
those milestones?
Yes, so we have an escrow agreement. So just to be clear, oh, it says it here. There's $3.6 million sitting in a bank account that the city has viewing access to that is specifically there with no sunset provision until we start construction of a movie theater. At a very high level, at various portions in the theater construction, that money gets released. Because again, we are coming out of pocket, not through the loan, we are coming out of pocket to pay for the cost of this theater. So we need that money to be able to pay back our subcontractors to build this theater. So it's not like 100% of this gets released on day one. In fact, a good amount of it stays until the theater opens. But there is, we start construction, a portion gets released to us. We hit 50% construction, another portion gets released to us. We complete construction, the final portion gets released to us.
Okay, so it's like so it's based on percentage complete on the construction.
It's functionally based on that, yes.
Okay.
It's a little bit more specific than that, but yes, it's based on inspections and occupancy.
Mm-hmm. Second question around who is specifically asking for the extension of 4 months on the performance schedule? Is that Mill
Yes.
Creek or is it the theater?
It's Mill Creek. Well, it's both. It's just based on the practicalities of the situation. Once we sign a lease, we're going to need 3 to 4 months to complete drawings. That's already putting you past December. And then it puts you. We're in a close time range, but with zero buffer, and I don't think we'll be able to hit December 31st coming up. It's going to take a little bit to get everything back into place, consultants in place to get the design over the finish line here. And then similarly with theater opening for the public, we're going to need a solid year. So one of the things that we don't have under our control, right, is how long will it take for the building permit to approve? How long are supply chains going to take to have projectors delivered and ovens delivered? What I don't want to do, and I'm being very transparent here, is I just don't want to have to come back here with my tail in my hand saying, I didn't think I could meet it, and we didn't meet it, not for any reason of not trying, but just based on it's a complicated thing to get done, and it takes time.
Okay. That's it for me for now.
Other questions or comments? Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. Mr. Shields, could you, and Joe also, explain how the raising of the roof to accommodate the large format theater fits into all of this? That, to me, looking at, what's before us, presents the greatest threat of anything delaying us further, just for all the reasons that we know that construction projects get delayed. Is it our commitment on the city side to get the approvals for that roof lifting done by a date certain that meshes with this timetable that Mill Creek is suggesting to us? Or I just want to make sure that everybody is moving on the same track.
Yeah, and Gary may be able to, Mr. Fuller may be able to speak to this a little bit in more detail, but we did submit a site plan modification that is being processed at administrative level a month ago, 2 months ago. We met with the Architecture Advisory Board to review this with them, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this is in the process of effectively being approved along this same timeline. So that should not be a holdback from us, but Mr. Fuller, if you have anything to add to that.
Gary Fuller, Deputy Planning Director. Yes, that's under administrative review, and we're in the final stages of approving that, so that'll be approved within 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
The lease will be signed and publicized when, the agreements are worked out, or the agreements are going to get worked out and then the lease will be signed and announced. Dovetails with this 30-day thing. I mean, at some point, I'm hoping in the middle of September-ish, the lease will be signed, the agreement or the arrangements to raise the roof will be green-lighted, and then we'll be able to move forward. But I think it's obvious that it would be good if we could all jump in the pool together at the same time. Because
Agreed.
otherwise, it opens us to criticism, reasonable concern, that, we have given something and have not gotten a signed lease in return. So I guess my question is, what are the prospects of getting a signed lease that I think the documents say the manager can inspect or whatever? So a signed lease in our hands at the very same time as, or preferably slightly before, council would take final action on these requests.
Councilman Duncan, I think it's a fair request to say that we could have a final form of lease that has been reviewed by the city manager prior to that September 12th meeting. I can't tell you it could be signed because, very candidly, this is a key component of this. Without this, we won't be able to do the lease, but I could tell you we would have that final form done. That is our full intent, is to have that done. So effectively, they could happen in tandem, to your point.
Jump in the pool together.
That's
All
right.
right, well, I'm personally willing to move forward with what's requested in the proposed motions, I think, but I'd like to hear what others think about that, because they've all heard concerns raised by others on the council who are not here with us tonight in this vein, and those deserve to be raised and addressed, I think.
Other questions or comments? Mrs. Scott?
Is the motion that's in front of us to include, what's staff's position on the 3 outstanding requests? If I looked at one of the PowerPoints, it showed them still as outstanding. So this motion in front of us for EDA consideration contains what response to those 3 from staff thus far, if I'm asking that question sensibly?
Mr. Shields?
So staff is evaluating those 3 requests. The document that's before you, the draft agreement, does not have any of those 3 requests embedded into it, and that's because staff has resisted those being put into the documents. And so we'll continue to study each of these, and we would have a recommendation for you by September 12th if the developer, if Mr. Muffler maintains the request for these items.
Okay, and could I ask for more clarification perhaps from Ms. McCroskey, or just with regards to, I recall hearing concerns about holding future councils to the change in the, or capping tax rate. Could you just comment on that and any concerns you may or may not have?
The structure of this arrangement is that and all obligations by city council on this are subject to appropriation, as they must be to protect future councils. This has nothing to do with the rate that you set. You would not be capping a tax rate. What you're simply doing is agreeing to make economic incentive payments that are calculated based to some degree on the amount of actual taxes that come in to the city. And what you cap is the amount that you would pay back. It starts with the city. For each of the taxes, the city first retains a certain amount, and that remains with the city. And then between that amount and the cap is the amount of the economic development incentive payment that will be made back, appropriated each year by council, paid to the EDA to pay to the developer, because that's where you have authority to make these kind of payments. Does that help?
So the language isn't capping a tax rate, it's you're talking dollars, financial incentive, so it would just be worded slightly differently.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's it for the moment for me, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Okay, I do have some. Mr. Muffler, thank you for the update. So I'm going to start on the positive note. I think you buried the lead here in a bit. So I think this might be the first public forum where you've announced the theater operator, and you've talked a bit about kind of their performance. Is that now officially public since you were announcing here?
Yeah, I haven't put it out there in a release or anything because again, we're sitting here, we do not have a final lease, but, you know, their CEO did speak at the AAB meeting. It's been mentioned at the EDA hearing. So again, I think that it's premature to fully celebrate, but it does feel good that we're here and we can disclose our operator, and they're very excited to be here, assuming that we can all move this forward together.
That's good news. So up until now, I think you've been talking about Memorial Day 2023. What I'm hearing from
Yeah.
you tonight is that looks more like end of year 2023. Is that correct?
Correct. It's correct. It's not only just because this is candidly taking longer than we had anticipated, but also construction timelines are right now, you can't be conservative enough with the construction timeline given how delayed supply chains are.
Got it. So best guess right now, end of year, holiday season 2023?
That would be the goal, right? But it would be, you know, end of year 23, early 24, and that's assuming we nailed it, right? So we effectively need about 12 months from the time we've submitted for permits, assuming that we can get permits within a quick time frame. So it's you know, it's tight, which is again why we'd be asking for a buffer there. I think that frankly that last milestone, the theater open for the public, we're under construction. We've pushed this thing forward. Trust me, we're going to get that theater open as soon as we possibly can. I just don't want this agreement to expire because we can't hit December 31st. We hit January 14th or whatever.
Got it. So this is a good segue to those 3 milestones. So I'm hearing
Yep.
you say that the lease execution should be on track for September 30th. And I think I heard you commit in response to Mr. Duncan's question that you will get us a copy of the lease before September 12th that the city manager will review. Is that correct?
Correct. That's correct.
And it's those second 2 milestones that you are feeling like you need 4 more months for.
Correct.
Okay. And so I think I was one of the ones who really liked the principle of having milestones when we kind of discussed
Yeah.
this, because I think it does show that, you know, we got to show continued progress and effort, right? And so if you have to move out several months, I guess I'd ask between you and Mr. Shields to come up with, are there additional interim milestones before permits that, again, demonstrate progress and demonstrate commitment? So if I understand that it takes time to get permits, and I think city staff certainly will do our part to accelerate and get those permits through the process. But what are other things that you, I guess, can show us that we're marching towards getting permits submitted, if that is going to move out several months?
Yeah, I will think that through. I don't have anything off the top of my head. And one thing I do want to add, as I've mentioned in prior settings as well, in terms of the theater opening, remember theater openings are sometimes art as much as it is science. It isn't as much as just getting open as soon as construction's finished. It's about opening on a weekend that it makes sense to open, and in a month that it makes sense to open. If there's no movies, they're not going to open. They'll wait a month or two to open to make sure. It's incredibly important that when they open, they have bodies in the theater. They have bodies and seats. So again, that even more reason why I am asking for a buffer so that we don't force an opening.
So if not kind of milestones on the theater itself, I think one thing you've probably heard from council be a little grumpy about is the storefront installations at the rest of the commercial spaces. How are we doing there? And are those things that we can commit to making more progress on?
Yeah, I mean, as we showed in the retail update, as those tenants begin construction, anything with a label there should have storefronts in first quarter of next year. You know, all of the Broad Street there on the left building, all of that's going to be in place in 4 to 6 weeks.
So that corner of Broad and West, you said will have glass storefronts in 4 to 6 weeks?
Yeah, everything right there, all of those storefronts, and they'll probably start working on those storefronts in the next month. So with completion in 6 to 8, I mean, they want to be open in October. So you have to have all your storefronts complete by then.
So maybe it's things along those lines that, again, show us kind of progress along the rest of the ground floor commercials. I understand there might be constraints with the theater, but again, I think what you're going to hear from council is if timelines do need to move out, let's see some other milestones that we can hit that we can kind of show continued effort there. A couple other questions. So I understand that the main changes now to the economic development agreement is adding the meals tax and then the movement of 20 to 30-year terms. What the city retains in terms of, I guess, performance and assurance is the milestones that we talked about. I think it's now 36 units where COs are withheld. Is that correct, Mr. Shields?
Yeah, between the retail build out and the theater, I believe that number is correct.
Okay. I think one of the things I read from the VCs is I think once we get to 50% of commercial with tenant improvements underway, 20 of those can get released. Is that correct?
Mr. Fuller is more
Yes.
directly acquainted with that.
Okay. How are we doing with
Terry
that? Because
Full-
there is TI underway right now, right?
Yeah, what the status is under the tenant improvements is what you stated. Once they hit 50%, then those 20 units can be released. And what they're doing with the next item in terms of the VC special exception amendment is they've got those existing 20 units that are tied to the tenant improvements. They're adding 16 more units for a total of 36. And then they're committing the existing 20 plus the new 16 to guaranteeing the execution of the theater lease. And then once the theater lease is executed, the new 16 are released and the 20 still remain until that 50% tenant improvements is hit.
And how far away are we from that 50% threshold?
Let's see, Joe can probably address that better than I can.
Effectively, we won't hit it until the theater begins construction. So you guys will have, it's really tied to the theater. I mean, if you just think about how much of a lion's share of the theater commands.
Okay. And based on your residential occupancy numbers earlier, where you were at 70% occupied at Madera, 20% at Versa, those 36 residential units roughly represents how much of your unoccupied units? What I'm getting to is how much leverage, frankly, the city has here.
A lot. Yeah, no, we're feeling the pain already. You know, I'm trying to, you caught me on the spot and I can't do my math in my head right now, but I can tell you that those 36 units are meaningful to us.
Okay. And then dovetailing what Ms. Hiscott asked about kind of, because one of the open items you have for us, Mr. Muffler, is some sort of future assurance on the theater tax front. I think we've heard from the city attorney in the past that we can't bind future councils to not raise
Correct.
the theater tax. And that still also obviously is contingent on the General Assembly giving us permission to raise beyond the 10%. And if we do raise beyond the 10%, you essentially want some sort of sharing deal where we true up with you all, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's not a cap. It's not saying you can never raise the tax beyond 10%. It's saying if you go from 10% to 15%, well, then we share in that 5% so that the proportions, right, are the same as they are today. Now, if you all obviously raise to 15%, that's a bigger bucket of tax revenue. We will get a proportionate share of that, but that also upsizes your cap, while also understanding that it could penalize the theater itself, just depending on what other theaters and other jurisdictions in the area are doing. So there's a lot of moving elements to it, but this agreement is essential to us. And if our theater is getting penalized by additional taxes, we need the ability to supplement that with this income.
This is one where I feel like our interests are pretty aligned, though, right? Like, we certainly don't want to increase the theater tax to the point where we depress activity there. Like, that seems like a lose-lose for everybody, even if we end up getting a little more tax revenue.
Correct.
So is this one where you can just kind of trust us that this is not something that future councils will likely do?
You know, I would say, I would like to, I'd also say it the other way. If we put it in there, we don't need it, great. If we do need it, great, because then we're all aligned.
Okay. Mr. Shields, and so tonight, the motion is, even though it's a resolution, is really just a referral to the EDA, and it'll come back to council pending their input.
That is correct. And I will note that the second item, the next item on the agenda, is related to the theater as well, and that is to amend the special exception and the VCs associated with it to reduce the number of theater seats along the lines that Mr. Muffler mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, because of the way that this theater operator operates with larger seats and more space between the seats. I wonder, I just offer if the council, we could sort of go through that as well before you entertain motions on either, and then you could do motions together. I just don't want to surprise anybody by the second item before you've taken your action on the first.
That sounds like a good idea. One more thing before moving off of this one. I want to confirm the fiscal. So I think we quoted $1.7 to $2 million annual net fiscal impact, and that already included subtracting out the theater tax that was negotiated back in 2016. So what staff is saying is that the new impact based on adding the meals tax is $130,000 or $150,000 per year.
So our fiscal impact run of 2018 calculated $136,000 of revenue to the city from meals taxes. So if we get the first 10,000 of that, then the impact is $126,000. That's noted in the staff report, because it's a little bit confusing to go through those mechanics, I feel like the shorthand is it's $150,000 fiscal impact. But you do note that there's a little bit more behind those numbers as well.
Got it. And despite the seat number decreasing, we think that the changes in theater operators are a wash, and we don't really need to rerun the fiscal model again. Is that correct?
So we're talking with Becky about that, and we'll have a little bit more analysis, I'm sure, by September 12th. At this point, we think kind of the shorthand is it's a wash, but we are going to look a bit more closely at it, and if there is approval to move forward on this tonight, then we'll do some more analysis on it.
Okay. Any other comments before moving on to the 2B part of this item?
I think, sorry, one more. Mr. Muffler, the one comment that I have on this 4 months in the performance schedule is, you have your second milestone as the building permit application submitted. Are you saying that you need more time to get it submitted, or is it more time for the city to approve it?
No.
Are we changing the milestone, or are we changing the date? Because I'm hearing two different things.
Yeah, no, we want to keep it, to your point, we want it to be our feet to the fire, not necessarily the city's feet to the fire. That's not the intent here. So the thing that is in our control is drawings and submissions. To draw a theater is simply going to take, like I said, anywhere from 3 to 5 months to get a package together to submit for building permit application. So that's why we would like these dates moved, is because once we do sign the lease, just say mid-September, right? We're going to need probably until early next year to get everything pulled together to submit for permit.
Okay.
And then after that, then it would be in the city's somewhat control to approve the permits.
Yeah. Ms. Hiscott.
Just before we moved on, I wanted to reiterate Letty's comments earlier about the interim milestones. I know you're going to think about them, Joe, but I look forward to seeing what you can come back on that to show, good faith that we're both continuing to move forward and make progress. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the VC changes.
So Mr. Fuller is the staff lead on this, and so let me turn it over to Mr. Fuller, and I'm sure Mr. Muffler will speak to this as well.
Thank you, Vice Mayor and members of council. Gary Fuller, Deputy Planning Director. So Mill Creek is looking to modify the voluntary concessions under the special exception, and that was the one that was approved in 2018 and then updated last year in regards to the theater condition. And so there's really just 3 requested changes. The third one being the hold on 36 residential units in terms of COs that would guarantee the theater lease. That is tied to your previous item in that was on the term sheet for the agreement on the economic development agreement at the city's request. And so they've incorporated that into their request for the other 2 items, which was, as discussed briefly, was to reduce the minimum number of seats from 750 to 850 persons down to 550 range to 850 persons. And, this is based on the actual numbers in the 2018 agreement, and as amended, reflected the Studio Movie Grill and its size. And now the new operator is in the process of finalizing their design, and they're planning between 600 and 700 total seats. So request number 1 is to reduce the seat count. So it's really kind of a technical thing in the VCs. Secondly, just to clarify that our intent on our prohibited list of uses that are in the VCs is to not prohibit arcades as an accessory use, obviously as a principal use, but as an accessory use to a theater. This theater does plan to have that as an element. So this is a clarification in the second request. And then the third request is what we talked about earlier. Mill Creek is offering to strengthen the securities for the theater lease to be executed by adding 16 additional unit holds on the residential. That totals then 36, as I had described earlier. So at this point, the staff is recommending that these voluntary concession changes in terms of this amendment to the special exception be referred to the Planning Commission and the EDA for consideration recommendations, and then the council could bring that back on September 12th for final action. So I'm available for any questions, but I think this is a fairly straightforward request for these three items. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Mr. Duncan?
Question to, I think, our staff. Where did the concept of more apartment COs being thrown into this deal come from? Is that our idea or Mill Creek's idea?
That's the city's idea.
Okay. Interesting that, I mean, there's obviously a dollar impact. I'm trying to balance, you know, everyone's desire to generate, you know, the revenue that we hope out of this with, you know, a sensitivity to time. I mean, as Ms. Hardy's question suggests, you know, we're looking for milestones of progress anywhere and everywhere on this project. Storefronts for the leases, ground floor leases, you know, build outs, even, you know, how are things going across the street at Founders too. Everything is in the mix. And if I think we are feeling positive about those various milestones having been hit, then, you know, we have a better attitude about giving up or revising the agreement that we were talking about earlier. So I'm certainly willing to put this in the hands of the EDA and the Planning Commission to discuss in more depth the connection between you know, the time that it takes to do a drawings for a theater. I don't know, 5 months sounds like a long time to me. I mean, it's a space that we all know what the space is. It's built out. If the roof gets raised, I'm just not entirely comfortable with that extra time. If that's, you know, what the time is actually described as being used for, I don't really. But as I say, I'm willing to let others who are more expert. I just want, it's important that we keep moving forward with all deliberate speed on this project, because we're not the only, you know, entertainment dollar in town. You know, there are plenty of other, particularly if the economy picks up and pandemic begins to fade. You know, we're in a race with Tyson's and Mosaic and other places for folks' entertainment dollars, and I would like for them to get in the habit of spending those in Falls Church at the earliest possible date.
Ms. Vice Mayor, can we make the motion to, for both of these at the same time then? You want to list them and vote separately?
You should do each motion separately.
May I start to move to refer TR 22-36 to the Falls Church Economic Development Authority for its review and recommendation and schedule final consideration for September 12th, 2022.
Second.
Pause. I know we're not required to do a public hearing, but I do want to see if there's anyone who wants. Sorry. Pause. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity for any public comment. I know it's not required, it's not a public hearing, but. Okay, seeing none. I actually had a couple comments, but I think we had a motion and then a second. All right.
Correct.
So a couple of questions and comments. So while we're talking VC changes and site plan changes, Mr. Muffler, I think you've heard from me about this before, as well as our urban forestry folks and probably other residents around town. While we're talking about site plan changes with raising the roof, you're going to probably hear continued pleas for more green and more shade in the plaza. And I know that things will change once the storefronts are installed and there's more vibrancy, but I think this would be a great opportunity to think about additional movable planters that really balances kind of providing that green and vibrant space with something that can be flexible for what you envision the plaza being used.
Yep.
So when we come back and see it, I would love to see kind of what your recommendation is on that front. Second comment I had is while we were talking about Founders Road, do we have resolution, Mr. Shields, on the location of the bike share?
We actually have a call tomorrow at 9 a.m. on that one. Just sorry to interrupt, but we have a call tomorrow at 9 a.m. to review some potential opportunities.
In September. And finally, more of a question for staff. So I know this is not being requested and it's just really requested as an accessory use, but I did want to probe into why we are limiting arcade, roller rinks, and discos as prohibited uses at all. That may have been the thinking whenever these were come up with, but I guess looking at the success, for example, of Punch Bowl Social in Arlington, I think experiential retail is clearly doing better these days than pure sales. And so I would challenge us to think about, and this will relate to our work session item, to think about kind of in this new retail environment, what makes sense in terms of preferred uses, allowable uses, and prohibited uses, because I would challenge that an arcade may not be so bad. It's something that people might come to Falls Church for. And so I think people have been really excited, Mr. Muffler, at the idea of having that on the ground floor of the theater. But maybe a question for staff going forward is we should rethink about what commercial uses look like. Great. So we have a motion and a second. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Leon?
Yes.
Ms. Shantz Hiscott?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Thank you, council.
And that takes care of both TR 2236 and TR 22-35? Or no, that was just one? Okay.
That was just TR 2236.
So the proposed motion language for TR 2235 is what guides us, is that right?
Move to refer TR 22-35 to the Planning Commission and Economic Development Authority for review and recommendation to the City Council, and schedule public hearing and final consideration for September 12th, 2022, and advertise the same according to law.
Second.
Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Leon?
Yes.
Ms. Shantz Hiscott?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Muffler. We will see you in September.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your summer.
We'll see you before then, I hope. 9 o'clock in the mornings.
We will see you in September.
Is
You'll
there
probably hear from
anything
staff.
actually before Mr. Muffler goes away? Is there anything programmed for founders between now and Labor Day, or is the,
Is there anything programmed
yeah, and no
in terms of?
outdoor activities or anything like that?
Oh, I don't know. I would have to check in with our operations team. I'm not aware of any events
Okay.
this summer.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all.
Good night. Thank you. So I think our next item is moving on to the consent agenda before we get to the work session. Does any council member wish to remove any item from consent? We have the work plan, the 2-year work plan on consent. Mr. Shields, do you have any comments on this one? Good. Do I have a motion?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Madam Clerk?
Ms. Leon on the second?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Leon?
Yes.
Ms. Shantz Hiscott?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Shields. On the work plan, a quick comment. I think this might be my 4th one and is probably one of the most responsive and both ambitious work plans. So thank you for staff for committing to the breadth of everything that's been discussed. I look forward to seeing progress on all those items. Okay, so moving on to the work session. How are folks feeling? It's 9:25. Do we need a break or do you want to move on through? Okay, let's move on. Mr. Shields, are we ready to move on to the work session items?
We are. Thank you, Vice Mayor Hardy. And so the first item is a resolution to amend the VCs and the special exception for the Byron. And we do have our new planner, Mr. Jack Trainer, who is our staff lead on this. He will give a staff report. We're also joined by the owner of the building, and he is represented by Mr. Andrew Painter, and he will speak to this item as well. So in terms of order of proceeding, I think we'll start with Mr. Trainer, if that is agreeable, and then we'll turn it over to the owner for their presentation to the City Council as well. We're very excited to have Mr. Trainer join the city staff, and this is his first presentation, I believe, to the City Council. He was an intern with the city some years ago and has come back as a permanent employee, and we're very glad to have him. Mr. Trainer, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shields, and good evening, council members. My name is Jack Trainer, part of the planning staff, and tonight I'll be presenting the Byron Special Exception Amendment to the voluntary concessions related to the first floor commercial space, retail service, and office uses. First, the request for council is to hold this work session and provide preliminary comments to the applicant and staff on the requested special exception amendment to the Byron voluntary concessions. The applicant's request, who will dive into it following me in a little more detail, but I'll go over kind of the service level details. That request is to amend the voluntary concessions to the Byron, which are listed beginning on line 73 of the staff report. And I'll just go through them quickly. The first one is to expand the list of permitted uses to include convenience stores, nail salons, hair salons, and ABC stores. These uses are generally permitted in the city's other retail centers, including in recently approved mixed-use redevelopments. Second, to expand the list of prohibited uses to align more closely with what the city now expects in recently accepted voluntary concessions. 3, to remove the 5-year limitation, including the single 5-year renewal on leases for professional office and office uses. 4, to require signage and pavement markings for commercial parking spaces in the Byron's courtyard area and parking garage to state that said spaces are reserved for commercial tenants. 5, eliminate the limitation on the percentage of primary street frontage that may be occupied by retail and retail service uses. And finally, 6, update the previously approved voluntary concessions from 2011's resolution number 2011-25. I'll give a quick background on the development and the request. The Byron is a mixed-use development with an address of 513 West Broad Street. It was completed in 2006. It contains 90 residential condos and approximately 18,422 square feet of commercial space. The applicant is Simon Lee, who owns the ground floor commercial units 110A, which currently holds Penzeys Spices, 110B, which is vacant, 110C, which holds Action Academy, and Unit 130, where Harvey's Restaurant currently is. And those ground floor spaces total approximately 9,396 square feet. The property is zoned B1, limited business, and sits within the West Broad Street planning opportunity area. And the Byron's original special exemption has been amended before. It was amended in 2003, 2007, and most recently in 2011. And each amendment sought to address the types of commercial uses to fill these ground floor bays. For instance, the 2007 amendment allowed for a neighborhood scale bank to be installed, and the 2011 amendment allowed for some limited office and professional office uses with those least restrictions that are being sought to be lifted, like I mentioned earlier. The Byron voluntary concessions were part of a set of approvals that limited the ground floor commercial use to retail only originally. This was a practice that was used for many early mixed-use development special exceptions, but is not the practice with recent special exception approvals. Line 143 of the staff report holds a couple industry definitions on retail and retail service that I want to read quickly. Retail is generally defined as an establishment where goods are exchanged for purchase and removal from the premises, while retail service is generally defined as an establishment that provides services as opposed to goods. And I'll end my run through of the staff report quickly with staff recommendations and analysis. the main kind of staff recommendation takeaways, first regarding the prohibited uses, staff recommends updating the list of prohibited uses to match what has been used with more recently approved applications. This would actually increase the list of prohibited uses, but allow for all the uses that the applicant is requesting. Secondly, staff recommends removing the office lease term in retail and retail service restrictions on all commercial units, including 110A, which again holds Penzies, 110B, which is vacant, and 110C, where Action Academy is, with retail tenant requirement capped for at least 110A, again, where Penzies is. While under the applicant's ownership, Unit 130, where Harvey's currently is not included in this VC revision request and would remain retail or restaurant uses only. Parking management. The applicant is the owner of the commercial space, as I mentioned, and the commercial parking is shared by all property owners on site. And so an approval of the Byron Condo Association would be required prior to the city accepting this additional VC, which would be for the applicant to submit a parking management plan for the parking area. Additionally, staff is requesting a compliance with the bike parking requirements. The applicant should consider compliant strategies for bicycle parking and storage requirements of its commercial and office uses, which we estimate to be 6 to 7 bike loops to accommodate for visitor and long-term accommodations for the commercial spaces. 5, the applicant should also consider adding a voluntary concession allowing city staff access to the garage for parking utilization counts and to monitor VC compliance with proper advance notice given to the owner. 2 more, sidewalk ingress and egress. The applicant should consider adding a voluntary concession that all commercial space fronting West Broad Street with retail entrances should offer ingress and egress to and from the adjacent sidewalk. And our last recommendation comes from the review from the Environmental Services Council, stating that the applicant should consider environmental offset strategies if proposed new retail and retail service uses are employed, which would have an increased use of water, chemicals, electricity, and solid waste production. So with that, before I turn it over to Mr. Painter, based on the above recommendations and City Council's comments, this request would require a new submission from the applicant, addressing staff's comments and council's comments as they come. Future consideration could be scheduled in September. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Andrew Painter, who is here with a short presentation that will highlight the request and is the agent for the applicant. Thanks.
Good evening, Mr. Painter. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, excuse me, and members of council. Good evening. My name is Andrew Painter. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of Mr. Simon Lee, who owns the Byron at Falls Church LLC, which is the entity that owns the ground floor commercial spaces. And Ms. Mester is bringing up the slideshow. But as Mr. Trainer said, we are talking about units 110A, 110B, and 110C. We have filed this special exception amendment for a text amendment to the voluntary concessions. And the idea really is to permit additional flexibility in terms of marketing the Byron's ground floor spaces to prospective tenants. I am joined by Craig Cheney, who is a principal broker at KLNB. He has primary leasing responsibility for the Byron. And so after I get done with my talking points, I'd like to turn it over to him just to be able to underscore some of the things or correct me. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just to start off, wanted to give you all some updates since August of 2011. Members of EDC have heard some of this, but after 16 months of being vacant, Unit 130, which is where Harvey's is finally leased, and that opened up in March of this year, and we're very proud of that. I think a lot of us have eaten there, and it's a very good fit for that space in the form of Placa space. After 19 months vacant in Unit 110C, which is the end cap space right next to the Stream Valley Park, Acton Academy opened in April of 2022. And then I guess a couple months ago, after 3 years vacant, we were able to sign a lease for the Diva Nail Salon. That is not a permitted use today, but would be permitted if the voluntary concessions are amended as we have proposed. But that is pending City Council approval. And then last but not least on this slide, we have been working with the Byron Condominium Association about the parking situation. Madam Vice Mayor, this is an issue that you had brought up at the EDC, and we are happy to say that we've resolved those issues as well. We're continuing to work with them as we go through this process. If we can go to the next slide. So these are a couple of the leasing issues that we've sort of identified. As Mr. Trainer said, the Byron was one of the first mixed-use redevelopment projects the city had when it was approved back in 2003. And at the time of the approval, city council and staff really sought to limit the uses. The idea was that this should all be retail, this should all be restaurant, because that's what contributes to an active streetscape. The goal really was to limit those street-level uses to those types of active uses. But with the benefit of hindsight 20 years on, it is clear that the city's restaurant and retail landscape has changed in many ways for the better, but in some cases, consumer preferences have dampened the enthusiasm for both of those types of assets. And so these are a number of issues that we have identified that have made leasing challenging on this particular site. Underutilized and underperforming vacant spaces, lack of streetscape activation, and frankly, an unappealing, inviting welcome for those that are walking or driving along West Broad Street, which of course is the city's main commercial thoroughfare, not the only one, but the main one. Overly strict prohibitions on retail service and office uses that Mr. Trainer had mentioned. These are types of restrictions that we just don't see anymore in the mixed-use redevelopment projects. The 5-year restriction on office tenant leases. There is the ability to get one additional 5-year extension administratively, and that sounds good because then you're looking at 10 years. But from an investment perspective and a tenant fit-out perspective, we find that really hampers the ability, the prospective marketplace for tenants, because there's no guarantee that they're going to be able to get that additional 5-year administrative extension. And last but not least, we've needed to address the parking issues between the residential and the retail and office components. And as I mentioned, we've been working with the Byron residential unit owners on that. If we can go to the next slide. These are some of the existing restrictions that we talked about that we believe have both stifled our prospective tenants, from attracting them. But it's not just the ability to get tenants in these spaces. It's also stifling city revenues, getting tenants in the space, realizing those revenues from having fully leased ground floor space, and also the streetscape activation. There's just nobody there, walking by, and it's not very inviting, as I mentioned. And we already talked about the limitation on office in Unit 110C and the 5-year lease term. The next slide, please. So after we met with representatives of the EDC, after we've talked things through with staff, and after we've gone back to our prospective tenants, we sort of established these long-term goals because, we do believe it's critical to amend these VCs, to introduce flexibility, to recognize those recent marketplace changes, and I think also ensure that this property is not at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis newer mixed-use developments that are coming online. And I think the goal really is to unleash the property's leasing potential to more readily fill unoccupied space and increase pedestrian activity, and allow Craig and his team to more quickly respond to opportunities. If we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to kind of distill it down, this to its sort of salient points, just to walk you through sort of point by point so everybody understands what we have proposed, because it can kind of all sort of glom on together. So the first proposed change relates to voluntary concession 7. So everything that you see underlined is proposed new text. And what this would do is expand the list of permitted uses that are generally permitted in other retail offerings or other retail centers and buildings in the city. But it also seeks to expand the list of prohibited uses to align with what is now expected with our mixed-use redevelopments in the city. So just increasing that, that prohibited use list, but also expanding the use list. And frankly, if you look at some of these things, allowing ABC stores or liquor stores. That was a use that maybe 20 years ago, we weren't thinking was a viable use or a use that would generate positive pedestrian activity. But now it is. I mean, the way that things are going in the Commonwealth, it's a very attractive use. The Vice Mayor had mentioned arcades. We're looking at that as well. Convenience stores. These are things that were previously prohibited that we would like to be able to add back in. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, so again, it adds convenience stores, nail salons, hair salons, video stores, liquor stores to the list of permitted uses, and then, as I mentioned, adds to the list of prohibited uses. We can go to the next slide, and that's the most substantive one. Okay, proposed change number 2 deals with voluntary concession 8. So it's doing some housekeeping. It updates the unit numbering and all the square footages. It allows professional office uses on all the ground floor spaces, and it removes the requirement that leases be limited to 5 years with that 1 5-year renewal, as Mr. Traynor had mentioned. If we can go to the next slide. The next slide talks about signage and pavement markings to distinguish the reserved commercial spaces from the residential spaces, requiring us to do that. And as we've talked about with staff, this is going to require a site plan amendment. So we'll work through that site plan process, but at least it'll be memorialized here in voluntary concession 9. If we can go to the next slide. Proposed change number 4, this removes the limitation on retail and retail service uses. This actually aligns with the Arlington County retail plan, not that we have to do what everything, Arlington does, but they have also recognized that, retail services, certain limited office uses are equivalent uses in terms of retail if they're done properly. And so we're seeking to remove that limitation, which we don't usually see in today's voluntary concessions. Next slide, please. This goes back to something Mr. Traynor had mentioned. We are proposing to install 1 bicycle rack on the property, and so we're memorializing that. Next slide. And then last but not least, again, housekeeping administrative, just updating the resolution numbers for all the voluntary concessions. And then if we can go to the last slide, I believe. So, this really does allow additional commercial uses, but it's not just for the benefit of the owner, it's really for the benefit of the entire city, the city's treasury, and the streetscape activation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Cheney. He can, again, correct anything I may have misstated or underscore some of the points that I made. Craig?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I think Mr. Painter did a pretty good job of explaining all the challenges we've been dealing with. I've been handling the leasing of the Byron for the last 3.5 years. I have a career of 22 years in commercial real estate brokerage. What I can tell you from my experience is that some of these spaces that we've taken 19 months, 16 months, and the last space that we have leased currently, that we just signed a lease currently of, that's been vacant for 3 years, that's above average for a place like Falls Church to have vacancies for this long. And it is primarily because of the restrictions that we've been dealing with due to the voluntary concessions. So I really feel like this is going to be a big help if these get approved to help to get these spaces leased faster, especially when as we move forward and as retail is changing in the future. And so we're hopeful that this will get approved so that it'll make my job easier, and it'll fill these retail spaces for the city.
And just to conclude, Madam Vice Mayor, to talk about some of the staff requests. In the staff report, there are 6 enumerated requests, and there's a series of things that were brought up this evening, which we haven't had time to analyze, but we will. I mean, a lot of them sound very reasonable. But just to let you know, of the 6 things that are listed, including, standardize the prohibited uses, keep the retail requirement at least for Penzies, and note that Harvey's would remain required to be restaurant and retail uses only. Updating the parking with stenciling and signage, approving that via site plan, submitting revised voluntary concessions by September 1st, and getting a letter of approval or support on the proposed changes from the condominium association. Those seem very reasonable to us, and actually they will further limit the scope of this. And so we're in full support of those as well. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Connolly.
Thank you for that presentation. I have several questions. One just relates to Mr. Painter. There are upper-level commercial tenants as well. Are they members of the condo association? How do they fit into this mix?
It's my understanding that they do belong to the condo association, although those units are not owned by Simon Lee, who is applying for this amendment.
Okay, as we looked at approving this before any of us were on council, as I look around, I don't know how those units were considered as part of that commercial mix. And does that affect this commercial mix?
It does not, Ms. Connolly, only because the voluntary concessions specifically call out these ground floor uses, the specific units themselves. And so we've limited the scope just to units 110A, B, C,
Okay.
and that's it.
Mr. Trainer mentioned as he was talking about access to the parking garage. That is not in the 6 ones this year. Is that what you were considering as something that needs more consideration?
Some of the follow-on items that Mr. Trainer had mentioned, we'll have to look at that, and we have no problem looking at that within the time frame, I think, before we return to council.
Okay. And then one of the things we've been talking about with Founders Row is just the bike share. And I know we have a limited number of bike shares, but is there space for a bike share at the Byron?
So we haven't evaluated that. I'm not sure whether there would be an interest from Capital Bike Share for one here, but I will tell you the courtyard area is extremely constrained as far as space goes. And we're already at pains to try to provide sufficient parking for our commercial and residential tenants as it is. So, I mean, we're happy to look at it, but I'm not sure that there's space for it. And it would have to be in the interior of the courtyard as well. So visibility might be challenging.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Hiscott.
I have a really simple question. You're asking for video stores, like to be included, I guess, as an option. Yeah. It's like bringing disco back and arcades back. We're bringing video stores back. I mean, is there a different context I'm not aware of? I don't know of any video stores.
We had struck that out.
I'm
We're
curious
happy
if
to
you
eliminate it.
had a reason you wanted that included again. TikTok.
I think the
video?
reason why that was stricken was because we didn't want to limit ourselves. Practically speaking, the probability of doing a video store is pretty low. So, I mean, if
I
that's
just want to know if it's something new in
No,
the
no,
next
there's nothing new to it.
generation that we're like, maybe we're on the leading edge of bringing something into.
no, there's nothing
Just hoping.
that hasn't occurred.
Get that Blockbuster card ready.
Hey, we used to bring in money there. Okay,
Other-
that's actually it for now.
Mr. Duncan.
Well, let's start with the good news. The good news is that the Red Lobster, which used to be there, is not there anymore. So the building has been a huge success, no matter, what else we say. Second, let's say that we do what you're requesting we do and unleash the market. So in the vein of what Councilmember Hiscott just said, if there's one common comment that I think I've gotten more than any other in the 10 years, it's, gee, we need, something new and cool and different on our main street. We don't need another yogurt store for a while, it was frozen yogurt. We don't need another nail salon, even though everybody goes to the nail salon, apparently. We need a blank. And I'll ask, well, what is blank? What is it that you would go spend your money at? So I'm going to take advantage of Mr. Cheney's presence here to, what can we, the building, as I said, I think is done pretty well. We've got Harvey's, a locally owned restaurant. We got Penzies, which is, a national credit level store with a big following. Acton Academy seems like a great use for an education-oriented city. What would you envision might go in there, and how does it relate to the parking problem that Mr. Painter brought up? Because really, that's the biggest problem in this building. It's why, Placa left, because they couldn't get enough parking. It's why we always have told you at the EDC meetings, come to us with, a clear signage regime for the garage that explains to people where it is you've got to go and where you can't go, because what's there now is just way below, what's needed. So combining all those questions together, speculate a little bit about, what great things are going to unfurl if we basically liberalize the approach. Is it really just going to be a nail salon, got nothing against nail salons, convenience store, nothing against that. But let's be clear to people that that is the sort of use that's, foreseen rather than, I don't know, a TikTok vinyl record video disco parlor or whatever.
Before I recognize Mr. Cheney, I would just say the amount of space that we're talking about total is about 8,000 square feet. So about half of that, a little bit more than half of that, I would say is taken up by the exact type of retail that we always envisioned in restaurants. So that's Harvey's, which is something you can't find anywhere else, and there's Penzeys Spices, which is also something you can't find anywhere else. So really what we're talking about are the two end spaces, and that's about 4,000 square feet. And maybe it's okay to have, uses that aren't as, wow spaces that also don't generate as much in terms of traffic generation, but are also needed by the community. We have been working with the residential owners on just that type of signage, painting, stenciling, making it very clear as to where the commercial spaces are versus the residential. But do you want to talk about unleashing the marketplace?
Sure. I guess as it relates to the last space, it's I think it's just under 1,200 square feet, and there's a limited types of uses that you can put in 1,200 square feet, and so that's one of the challenges, and it also. There's some constraints to the space that we can't do food there because you can't vent it. So there's a lot of different things that are happening that prevent us from doing maybe something that's cooler than a nail salon. I think the biggest tell is that the space has been vacant for 3 years. All the interest we've gotten over the last 3 years have been primarily hair salons and nail salons because those are the types of uses that can fit in that size square footage. As it relates to other types of retail uses that are selling items, they're looking for more shopping centers where you can park directly in front of it. And so, there's limited types of retailers that are willing to take a space that doesn't have traditional retail parking like the Byron does. And so there have been some constraints on what we're able to put in that space. And I guess I'll just comment on the parking, the signage that for the Byron, because the condo association actually came up with a plan, and they were ready to move forward on it with stenciling parking spaces, but they were told to stop because it needed to get approved. It required approval by the city in order to move forward with that.
Thank you. Well, yeah, it sure does. I mean, I'm happy that they're willing to move forward and look forward to hearing that. Okay, well, there's not much here you haven't heard before, but to summarize, the parking regime screened by the city staff, Mr. Trainer, Mr. Fuller, others who've been around need to give that a good hard look because, let's face it, it's a mess. And it can be better. It doesn't have to be a mess. I was just there today at Harvey's. We were eating lunch a little late, but no problem parking on the surface lots. It's just certain times of the day, I think, which leads me to point number 2, which is let's see how Acton is doing in the next month. I presume they're going to be sizing up for the new school year and so forth. I would just like to see our experience with parking for a use like that because we don't have a lot of experience with that. Pick up, drop off, how many people are sticking around for a while, parent meetings. I don't know what they're going to be doing there, but I'd like to get some idea what the traffic and parking demands are with that new use by the time you come back to us, or welcome come to the EDC in September too, and try out telling us whatever the Residents Association has done in the way of parking signage, and what our experience with Acton has been, and whether we can get that Debbie Hiscott vinyl record disco roller rink use that we all covet and hope for. You see, you weren't here. I think you were. Were you here earlier when we had the vision of the city as, we're all going to walk and bicycle everywhere? See, that might happen. And when it does happen, uses like spaces like you're talking about will be easier to fill because it'll be like New York City. There'll be a walking trade that will keep those places in business. But right now we don't have that. We just don't. We don't have that much density. And so we need some interim solution for the next 20 or 30 years, I'd say, while people are still driving around in cars, mostly. And I think we just have to be responsive to that. It's in some way at the end of the day. So I'm sympathetic to what you want to do, but the parking garage signage is sort of a, that's the line that we've got to make an improvement in this time for, the next 20 years of use of this building.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Leon?
I thank you for explaining, providing more detail around the 1,200 square footage and then the fact that there's limitations on that. So I think that that is data-driven input that is helpful. I really, the biggest primary thing here is space that has not been sitting utilized, for 3 years. And so I appreciate that you're looking at this and coming forward to try to figure out, what we can do to get, that space utilized. I'm supportive of local businesses, and I think if we expand the uses, I think it makes sense. I do ask that you make sure that you consider some of the requests that staff is making around environmental offsets and just accessibility, right, around sidewalks, right, and all those suggestions coming from staff. But overall, my comment on this is I think it makes sense.
Okay, I have a few questions and comments. Mr. Trainer, I'm going to start with you. So first of all, welcome to the city. We're thrilled to have you. Really nice and thorough job with the staff report and the presentation tonight. A question for you. How does staff feel about lifting restrictions on both the Acton and Penzi space and not just 110B, given that there are active leases underway? Why not just lift it for the one that's vacant?
Perhaps Mr. Fuller can help me out with this, but I think given the history of the revisions on this site for, I believe, all of the commercial spaces, I think that, added to staff's, I guess, willingness to go with all of the spaces, just, in case to mitigate any future revisions that may come back in the future.
How does that
Gary Fuller, Deputy Planning Director. I would add to that in looking at this has had 2 amendments to the, retail-only focus that we started off with. And, the recent mixed-use projects, we've come up with a list of prohibited uses, which is a little longer than the list that's currently in here. But the 4 uses they're allowing to now have are not on that list, so they would be getting what they wanted. And the thought is, we just make this flexible and let the market serve the space. And at this point, just list prohibited uses and be like the last 3 special exception that we've approved, where we've basically just said, here's the ones we don't want for sure, and then just allow them to have office there, service there, as well as retail there. Ideally, if Penzi were to be able to be there long term as a solid retailer, that would be preferred. But I think at this point, 20 years later, the flexibility for everything but Harvey's is probably the way to go. So that's kind of where we've ended up. And then the other additional things that the previous council member was referring to that we've suggested for the applicant to consider with the VCs are ones that were recently also approved in special exceptions and represent an update to this older one that was approved in 2003. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think I mostly get it that, we just are trying to avoid having to come back around for those ones. That said, I don't want to create any perverse incentives, though, where if Penzi's lease is up, that you have a more lucrative offer on the table to replace them, right? Like, that's the thing I want to be careful of, that we don't open this up and then you actually replace the thing that we actually like there already. And so I guess I'm thinking about whether it's just worth it to open it up for 110B, given that's where you have had trouble leasing. So something to think about.
You want to speak to that?
Second question, given that we've seen you multiple times in EDC now, we've spent a lot of time talking about parking. Could we go to that slide that talked about kind of the challenges with why you're having leasing issues? There we go, that one. So I know we're talking about obviously a couple items on there, the lease restrictions and then the prohibited uses. I think in the past in EDC, we've talked about how parking, as Mr. Duncan talked about, has been a challenge, and it sounds like hopefully we are on our way to resolving them. What about the other things? Like, while we've got you, like, how are we going to work on activating the street frontage? Like, if that was a more appealing space, would you have an easier time leasing out your spaces?
Well, I mean, I mean, for the last couple of years, at least for the last 19 months as it relates to the end space and the last 3 years as it relates to 110B, there have been signs up that say, you know, if you're interested in leasing this space, please contact Craig. And that provides no streetscape activation whatsoever. So in a lot of ways, putting at least uses in there that are generating tax revenue and that people are walking in and out with that porosity with windows and seeing people inside and out, that provides the streetscape activation that I think that we're all looking for. We're not changing the physical characteristics of the building. We're talking about the uses within the building themselves. And if there are no tenants at all, then it's dark space. It's not welcoming at all. Nobody's, there's no eyes on the street or anything like that. So when we talk about streetscape activation, I think what we're really talking about is allowing uses, a broader potential pool of uses to locate in those spaces. The other things, the 5-year restriction, that's addressed in the proposed changes. The overly strict prohibitions on retail service and offering uses or office uses, we talked about that. That's also addressed in the proposed changes. And then the top one, I think, is the most important, the underutilized and underperforming vacant spaces. They could be doing something in terms of generating tax revenue, generating jobs, providing services for city residents, and at the same time providing that streetscape activation. And that's what I think this really gets at. So.
Got it. I was hoping you'd propose something really exciting on the streetscape. Sounds like you just want them occupied, and we hope that will be activating.
Yeah, I mean, the streetscape, it meets the 2017 streetscape requirements. It's it's fully built out. The brick pavers are out there, the trees are there, the street lights are there. It's kind of what we would want to see.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
So I think something else just to add to that is, when a space is vacant for a long time, a lot of retailers notice that, and it's concerning to them. And so sometimes getting a tenant in there to just kind of get it activated is something that's really beneficial for future leasing. But the longer it goes vacant, the more difficult it sometimes can become to fill it because a lot of retailers that scares them. So I think doing something to just get. I know that a nail salon is not the most exciting thing in the world, but it can activate the space for the future.
Ms. Connolly, you had something?
I just have a thought on the streetscape, which you just mentioned, which in our work plan is to review the streetscape and look at the brick pavers and crosswalks specifically. But I think the streetscape in front of this building actually is that to which we should aspire. The brick works, and it's open, and the landscaping looks good. So I do think that the streetscape itself is very good, and my personal opinion is it should be left as is because it's very activated.
Well, and just to respond to that comment as well, I mean, if there are uses that we're able to attract to this space, restaurant uses or other types of uses that want that indoor-outdoor connection, outdoor seating or things like that, then we would be back in front of council asking for permission for outdoor seating, for example. Overhead, bulb, catenary lighting and things like that, if there was space, so.
Okay. Go ahead. Oh, okay. Okay. So back on parking, our favorite topic here. So I do think that getting the parking right is key, given that was one of the challenges with your previous tenant. So I think if we were to move forward with this, and it sounds like you've got a pretty receptive set of audience that, does want to adapt to the new retail reality here, right? But I think it's that careful balance between how do we hold firm on these changes that were negotiated 20 years ago and make sure that we get what we originally wanted. I think it was good context that in both 2007 and 2011, there were amendments. I did not realize we actually amended it twice now. But on the parking front, I think a request for staff is if we approve the new uses, are the required parking spaces different than what we have now? And if so, can we be proactive with that marking or signage, that plan that was discussed by the applicant, so that we are prepared for those changes? Because I would hate to kind of allow these changes and then create a parking situation that drives out the tenants. Does that make sense? Like, can we anticipate what the parking needs might be based on the new uses? This is a question I had asked in EDC last week. I just want to be proactive on the parking front and not allow the uses, create a parking issue, and then lose a great tenant like Harvey's, for example.
Gary Fuller, Deputy Planning Director. We had suggested in our staff comments and our review that the association, the condo association, in conjunction with the commercial owner, have a parking management plan in place. And, it doesn't have to be, terribly sophisticated, but a plan that addresses a number of basic guidelines and management kind of operating procedures we think is important to make this parking work. You have a number of spaces that are dedicated just to the commercial, basically almost all the garage and all of the surface spaces, and so how you regulate those is important. And then in terms of the uses, the only real review is the zoning administrator will look at the use and look at the generation based on the zoning code for that particular use, and he will ascertain whether there's enough parking there to support that particular use. And so that's really the only check. And so I think this parking management plan would address the issue that you're getting to, where, we need to think about what we're doing here and how it's going to impact the parking usage and based on the uses and their hours of operation and what kind of, generation they have in terms of parking demand. So I think that would help. And I think that's something we're hoping the applicant will consider in a basic plan.
Great, and also hopefully the bicycle parking, I think that's one of the recommended things from staff as well. So I like the list that staff has proposed, like the environmental offsets, garage access. One thing I'd ask you to consider while we're thinking about kind of the site usage is, one of the common complaints I hear is that you often have delivery trucks blocking a lane, blocking the entrance, if not the lane at the Byron. I'm not sure whether the garage is big enough to provide dedicated access, but if we are talking about modifying essentially VCs at this point, I think one thing we've learned with new developments is that delivery trucks can't park on Broad Street. We require that they, pull off inside the development. And so if there's an opportunity to think about how to do that creatively with the Byron, it certainly would be helpful to get those big semi trucks off of Broad Street double parked.
Yeah, we can certainly take a look at that. And I don't know what the height restrictions are.
There are some height restrictions that prohibit the trucks from being able to pull in. Especially, I guess I'm not familiar with all the trucks that are going by the project. If they're tractor trailers, I don't think they can get in and out. There's just not, the turn radius is not conducive to a tractor trailer. Now, the box trucks can get in and out, and there's a loading zone in there for them. So I guess there are limitations, though, to what kind of trucks can get in and out of the project.
Okay, well, you get some of them off the Broad Street. That's great. So let's think about that. That's it from my comments. Mrs. Scott, you still had a final one?
Yeah, it's, I have a question for staff, actually. Are vape shops considered drug paraphernalia establishments, or since they're not, they're kind of tangential to, how are those classified? I'm just thinking about having another vape shop pop up in that 1,200 square foot would probably not be ideal choice for some people, but I don't think it's necessarily a drug paraphernalia either.
I think what happens is the zoning administrator, if a particular use type, let's say a new use, is not specifically addressed in the zoning code, then there would be a determination that would be made, and whether it would fall in the category you just mentioned or not. So, I can't answer that it's allowed or not allowed at this point, but the zoning administrator would make that determination since it's not a listed use.
On the slideshow, it looks like it's listed in the...
So it's line 398, 389?
Okay, so it's there.
Stores selling
Okay.
primarily tobacco, electronics, cigarettes, vaping products, vaping supplies, e-liquids, or similar materials, or cannabis products.
All right, that would cover it then. Yep.
Okay, sorry I missed that. Sorry to waste anybody's time.
So, No problem.
While we're, just one other thought, the next line speaks to sidewalk ingress and egress. Just for everybody else's, there's been lots of talk about Founders 2 and, the intersection of the sidewalk, traffic, kids coming back from school, and the traffic coming up out of the garage. And they've got bollards in the mirrors, and there's a whole regime to promote safety in that site plan. And it occurs to me that the barn doesn't have anything. Just a big hole that traffic goes into and pedestrians walk across. And I've not heard that there's been any problems with that. At any rate, just something to think about, how we have standards that sometimes apply to new developments that don't apply to old developments, even though there's no problem that we've had with the old development on that point. Just something worth thinking about.
Great. Alrighty, well, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you all. It's great seeing you all. So, all right, thanks.
Alrighty. Last item on our work session, Mr. Shields is discussing COVID-19 emergency declaration.
So, Council, we've been asked to just take a look at, from the COVID planning team's perspective, thoughts on lifting the state of emergency that the city's been under since April, really since March of 2020, ratified by the state of emergency, ratified by the City Council on April 6, 2020. This declaration of emergency has allowed us to do a number of practical things. It has, one, allowed us to be more flexible in our application of zoning rules for businesses as they opened during the pandemic under the governor's mandates to maintain social distancing and other public health requirements, and gave them additional flexibility. Those are still in effect today under this state of emergency. The other kind of significant practical implication is that our boards and commissions and our city council can meet entirely virtually because of the state of emergency, which gives us that flexibility. We have surveyed other jurisdictions just to see what others are doing. From the beginning of this pandemic, we've tried to, A, follow the best advice of our public health professionals, and two, we have tried to act in concert regionally so that we're not doing things that are significantly out of step with others in the region. Just a quick review of states of emergency in Northern Virginia. The town of Herndon is one jurisdiction that still is under their declaration of emergency. All of the other jurisdictions, to the best of our knowledge, have lifted their state of emergency. All of the jurisdictions, including the City of Falls Church, but other jurisdictions as well, are meeting in person for their governing body. And the thought was tonight to have a discussion with the City Council in terms of what the City Council's direction is on this. Because this declaration of emergency was ratified by the City Council, to lift it, we believe needs an act of the City Council as well. And I'd be happy to answer any other questions. The COVID planning team did get together, and they believe, they offered to me kind of on balance that lifting the state of emergency would be acceptable. There are no FEMA rules right now in terms of, it had been for a number of months in the beginning of the pandemic that you needed to be under a state of emergency in order to submit for federal reimbursement of certain expenses. That is no longer the case. FEMA has sort of loosened that rule so that you can still get reimbursements for certain pandemic-related activities without that declaration. So the meeting issue is an important one for the council to consider. And then if the council were to lift it, we would recommend at least a 6-month transition period to allow businesses to adjust to going back to without that zoning flexibility, or for the city to consider ordinances that would make some of those flexibility provisions permanent or under a special use permit. You may recall we looked at that about a year ago. It is fairly complex, and so at that time, I think maybe everybody was somewhat relieved that we gave ourselves a little bit more time to work with the business community on that transition as well. So I'll stop there. And Ms. McCoskey, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of advice to the City Council on this?
The one thing that I will say is that the ordinance, it was ordinance 2011 that provided for all the zoning flexibility under the state of emergency. That ordinance, by its terms, will not expire until 6 months after the declaration of emergency ends. So in other words, if you were to end the emergency within a month, there would still be 6 months for those flexible ordinances to be in place until their effectiveness would end. And you could obviously take some action in the meantime, but that's how it was set up when we adopted it.
Before I open up for comments and questions from council, Ms. McCoskey, could you, because I know you sent us memos, but for the public's benefit, we can only have electronic meetings during a emergency, correct?
That's correct. Electronic meetings where there's no quorum present can only happen when there's an emergency, and the catastrophic nature of the emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe for you to gather in a room together.
And that is authority granted from the General Assembly. And so the only authority they've granted us is the 25% individual participation that we got 2 years ago.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. Questions and comments from council?
Yes.
Ms. Leon?
Is there any flexibility? Can we amend the 6 months transition for the zoning ordinance 2011? There's a concern on negatively impacting businesses that are still trying to recover. So I'm looking at how we can be smart about that. Can we amend that 6 months transition?
I would have to check. You could certainly make it shorter. I'm not sure that you can make it longer, but I would have to verify that.
Yeah.
But you could provide for things to step down or something like that, certainly.
Yeah. I would definitely be a proponent of taking a look at what we can do, permanently in the zoning ordinance that helps local businesses. Outdoor seating, I think, is one thing that was, positive coming out of the pandemic, and
I certainly
it's
think that
well-liked.
within that 6 months, you could certainly amend your zoning ordinance in any number of ways to provide that these things are allowed on a permanent basis by special exception or otherwise.
Okay. Unlikely to extend it. Okay.
It's just the authority to waive and flex your ordinances because of the emergency only goes to 6 months beyond the end of the emergency. But you, of course, always have authority to amend your zoning ordinances.
And Mr. Shields, when you casted your net to assess which jurisdictions are in a state of emergency, was it just within a certain mile radius?
So the city attorney put the question out to the city and county attorneys. So let me refer that question.
And I just did sort of there's sort of a group of Northern Virginia jurisdictions, but it goes out to Loudoun and Leesburg and Herndon, and so I didn't get responses from everybody in the area, but I had 5 or 6. Many jurisdictions, when they adopted their emergency ordinances, they were provided to lapse at a certain point by their own terms, so no action was necessary to terminate them. Herndon is who still has their declaration in place, is like us. They will need to act. The governing body will need to act before their declaration ends.
Ms. Connolly? Oh. Mr. Scott?
On that topic, when speaking to other jurisdictions whose emergencies have already lapsed, and presumably some of them have zoning, businesses like ours who benefited from extending ordinances, are there best case practices, lessons learned? I know we have some differing geographic constraints that some of our further west don't, and some other zoning differences from Arlington. But I mean, I know you said why this is really difficult, but I think you'll find almost all of us on council want to ensure the success of our small businesses and take advantage of the things that we did learn and what went well, without making it extraordinarily difficult for staff to create ordinances and businesses to be able to follow through, and how we do that. I mean, what can we learn from what others have done well, since we are on the tail end of this? That's my question. Obviously, I don't expect you to have an answer right this moment, but that's something I want to understand more fully before voting. I feel like we should be meeting in person. This is my own personal statement versus a question. I feel like we should be meeting in person like almost all of our other jurisdictions are, but I don't want to do that at risk of business that has been created and sustaining for so many in our little city. I also think that, again, this is a personal opinion, I also think it demonstrates the successes we've had of having meetings virtually, specifically with regard to boards and commissions, and having higher participation rates, are all the reasons that many of us were promoting this at the state level last year, to have more ability to have meetings like that. So I'm hopeful that, in years further down the line, that we can lobby to work on that as well, because I think that has been proven a success. But, we don't necessarily want to be saying that we're in an emergency when others aren't in order to do that, but we're also seeing the benefit of having those meetings remotely allows so many more people to participate. So there are lots of things underneath this decision, lots of layers to it. So just throwing those out for discussion and thought.
Just related to what an actual emergency is, what I'm hearing, we have concerns about lifting it because the benefits that we've gotten from being under a state of emergency are positive to businesses and to attendance. But the actual definition of emergency, it appears that we're out of that situation. We're not in that. Everything is open. People are open. There's in this room, there's 2 people wearing masks and everyone else is not. And it was convenient for people to call into this meeting, but it's not because of an emergency. It's because it's a state that we have decided works very well for all of us. So I feel like just the state of emergency itself is over, and we need to figure out what all the little pieces are that we need to work through. So that's one statement. Now my other question, and it relates to Ms. Heath, the way this meeting was run tonight, with people being able to call in, you have a quorum here present, but then staff can call in and outside community members. Would we be able to keep that, or would that have to end as well? Would all attendees have to be present?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
The only people who are bound by the being in person is the public body, if I believe I'm correct, City Attorney. So it would only be the public body. If we have the wherewithal in all of our meeting rooms to provide this kind of service, we could allow the public and staff and applicants to come in that way. That being said, we don't have that in every room that we have in City Hall, but it's something that I know we're planning to work on with IT, cable, and other facilities, Cindy, to try to make that work for almost all the boards. So did that answer your question?
Well, sort of. So the question is then, if that would work in this room for boards and commissions that meet, city council, school board, and other boards and commissions that meet in this room, does it have to be the same for all? So the library board meets in the library and the Human Services Advisory Committee would meet elsewhere. Would everyone have to fall under that same availability of a virtual meeting?
As far as I
virtual
understand it,
visiting?
there would be no legal requirement for that. And like I said, we may not be able to provide that for every board.
Right.
So, and we were doing this before we went into COVID. We just didn't have folks. We had people calling in, remember, on
Oh, right.
the
Okay.
system. We could have people call in. So we were doing a version of this, but all the boards weren't doing that because we just don't have it. And as far as I understand, there's no legal requirement for that to provide for remote participation by anybody, except for if one of the members is participating electronically, there's a quorum in the room, then they have to be able to be heard and to hear the meeting.
Right.
That's the only requirement as far as electronic meetings.
Okay. So what I'm thinking about public comment and community involvement and staff time as well, that if we were able to maintain that opportunity for staff members to call in from home or community members to call in from home, then we could still have a meeting in this manner, but it would be a face-to-face meeting for the public body. Sounds like we can.
Yeah, that is our
Okay.
planning assumption, is that we would, the body would need to be here, some staff would be remote, and the public would be able to participate remotely as well.
And they'd also have to have access to the room if
Okay.
they want it.
Okay. And then as far as warning time or preparation time, if we were to pass this or decide that we would approve this, would we approve this tonight or do we wait until our next meeting? And if we were to do so, how much warning would boards and commissions get? You know, I'm the liaison to the Human Services Advisory Committee. They haven't met in person at all. The library board decided to meet in person. So how much prep time would boards and commissions get?
For the meetings, we would like some time to adjust to it, and maybe the clerk could speak to that as well, and in terms of what the planning is for that.
I think we've been planning for this for a long time, so we do have some folks that have come back. I think the biggest transition will be finding space again, because we had tight space before we went into the virtual meeting, so we'll have to plan for that. But I feel like we could turn it around fairly quickly and work with folks. We have our new public meetings assistant who started today, and so we're hoping to leverage her to help people make the transition. That's going to be one of her first challenges. So, you know, I believe we were talking about bringing this to council September 12th for a vote. And you could say it takes effect immediately. You could, you know, say October 1st. I feel like personally, my office can work with either date. I think we're starting to prep people already that it's happening, so.
So you've read some of my thoughts about this in emails that I've sent. I'll try not to repeat myself. It's a good discussion, and it's encouraging to me to hear the focus on the impact on local businesses, because it's going to be substantial for some businesses. I mean, think of old, you know, Dominion Brewery, which had, you know, pretty small interior space to serve dinner until the pandemic, and now they've got a massive layout with full-time, you know, restroom facilities and so forth on the parking lot, where, you know, they used to be empty parking spaces. Other restaurants, you know, I'm sure come to other folks' minds. So, you know, going to be a lot of work for our zoning staff to bring those outdoor uses into some sort of compliance, I think. And that'll take some time, should take some time. I'd like to, because as Ms. Connolly said, it is a public health issue, right? I mean, that's why we need to keep our focus on that. So what code are we at now, the color code system in terms of transmissibility in our jurisdiction? Are we red, yellow, green? So we're yellow now, is that where we are? And what expectations do we have based on whatever we're hearing from Fairfax Health about where we're going to be, you know, once everybody comes back and goes to school, and what are we doing with our school system? You know, where do we stand? You know, we're in a hot spot nationally, I guess, on the monkeypox scale, D.C. and San Francisco. I mean, everybody has to make their own personal decisions about where they go and what they do and whether they wear a mask or not. I'm mostly concerned about, you know, increasing the number of opportunities where we require people to be in a small room for an extended period of time for no real good reason. In fact, I would argue that the hybrid meeting regime that we have enables, as others have said, more participation and more transparency than we have sitting here tonight with one citizen in the room. So I guess what I would say would be, let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's see what our experience is going to be once everybody comes back from vacations, starts school, what new variant is looming out there, what strategies do we have, to deal with it. Our metric for most of last year, or whatever year it was, get your vaccination. Okay, well, we focused on that and tried to drive that number up. What is the next metric of public health that we're aiming for now? What do we tell people that we would like for them to do in order to, do what's reasonable to promote public health? I frankly don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I've gotten my 2 shots and 2 boosters. Is it time to get another shot and another booster? I mean, we're reading things in the national news that suggest that you should do it now or you should wait. I don't know. To me, it's just not clear to a person who is trying to do the right thing exactly what it is they should try to do. And in that context, I don't see any good reason at all, as tonight's meeting indicated, certainly for staff and applicants to fill up a room for no good reason. They're just increasing their carbon footprint by driving, from their homes to our meetings. So I would like to know more about where we are in public health before deciding whether we want to drop the emergency. It's very commendable, I think, to say that we would like Richmond to consider, letting us continue to do this absent a public health emergency. But I think we all know the way the winds are blowing in Richmond, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So we're on our own here.
Anyone else?
Just, I think it's really important that we consider, our kids are back in school, they're in person, school boards are, back in person. I think we could probably ask, you, Mr. Shields, and you, Carol, to recast this poll around where the jurisdictions are. But I really think what we need to do is start planning to support what we need to do in these zoning ordinances to get things out of that zoning ordinance 11 into a steady state, right, that supports, economic activity in our city. I'd be supportive of going back in person. My biggest concern is making sure we take a look at this ordinance and start scheduling the right conversations in council to talk about what we can do to permanently adopt what's in that ordinance and make it status quo. So, and I'll leave it at that.
I'll just second that. I agree. I think that's the biggest concern. As Ms. He said, we've prepared for opening up meetings. Have we prepared for changing zoning? But I would support lifting the emergency as soon as possible.
Okay. So I have some comments. So on the outdoor dining front, do we really have to overcomplicate it? Like, can we just say what you're doing currently can live on? Or is that the zoning ordinance change that we're talking about? Or does staff have concerns with that approach?
I think we need to have another discussion about that with their zoning folks and planning folks.
Because if I recall where we ended the discussion is we were concerned about how laborious it would be for people to apply for the permits, and then we were in the emergency anyway, and so we kind of tabled it, right? I think the sentiment you're going to hear, especially now 2 years in, and we've gotten used to this new normal of all this outdoor dining and the vibrancy that we have in parking lots and those underutilized spaces, is we still want the barrier to entry to be very, very low. We don't want to create more work for businesses, given that we've all accepted it, and it's been great to use those parking lots that way. So to the extent that staff can support that, I think you're hearing enough voices up here that we'd like to move on and make that permanent. I really like how Mary Beth was starting to characterize the issues, because I get that this is hard psychologically for us to accept that, the pandemic is winding down. But if we try to separate the issues into, do we want the ability to have electronic meetings? Absolutely. I think we've shown through the pandemic that they're effective. We're increasing access and participation through COVID. I'd love for us to keep them around. And there's no reason that the General Assembly is not letting public bodies of appointed or elected members do it. But that said, they haven't. And so that's something that we should continue lobbying. And I'm looking at Cindy in our next ledge package to make sure that we continue advocating for it, because we've had 2 years of experience showing us that we can. So that's kind of one issue. The second one to separate from it is, do we have an emergency? And I have a really hard time looking at our numbers given where we are. And I think the new health directors in the last NVRC call that the mayor and I participated in, the 5 regional health directors continue to assert that hospitalization and death rates are very stable. And that is a new metric. And that is not looking at case rates. And that is that transition out of that kind of high pandemic kind of period, right? And so assuming that things don't take a turn for the worse, I agree with kind of Mary Beth and Caroline, is that I don't feel like we're in that emergency anymore, despite that being the main reason that for us to have the electronic meetings. But if we separate those two issues, as much as I would like to keep electronic meetings, I don't think we actually are in a state of emergency anymore. And it feels appropriate to make sure we give our boards and commissions ample time to plan for that transition. The 3 weeks of summer recess could make sense. So if we decide tonight that we want to lift the emergency, say effective after Labor Day, does that give us enough time to make it effective that first week of September? Is that enough planning time and lead time for kind of our boards and everyone and staff to be prepared?
We can do anything, I guess. Yes, we can do anything.
Given that some boards are in recess right now,
We just need
right?
guidance, and we can figure it out. We'll have to work out the schedule. I do have a question, just something for you guys to reflect on. I think we may have some boards that might be reticent to be in some of our smaller rooms. And so I sort of want to think about how that's going to affect scheduling. I think there is going to be some question about, should we all be in a tiny room together? So that's just another facet of it. But we'll make it work, whatever you guys decide, though.
And I think it's a good opportunity for us to remind everyone about that 25% participation, and that if you have a medical condition, that limit it's unlimited, right? You can actually participate remotely
As long as you
indefinitely.
have a quorum of the body in the room.
Okay. So it's probably a good time to re-educate folks on the flexibility. Mary Beth? Yeah, I am.
Because we're going into recess, and because probably some staff are taking vacation because we're on recess, it may be better to do it October 1st, just to give staff time to all be here to think it through, as a thought.
And then there could be a resolution prepared for September 12th.
I want to make sure the right signals are being sent and the work is underway, so that we don't just punt on this till September. So whatever form that takes, I guess.
So there's
I
sort
would
of
be
some-
okay with approving it tonight and saying October 1st, but that's me.
I will say that the code is not absolutely clear about what you have to do to lift it. It says by appropriate means. My recommendation would be that should council want to do a motion tonight, we could do that. But I would recommend that we do a resolution on September 12th, especially if we're looking towards October 1st. We can all be preparing for that anyway. But because you all consented to the declaration of emergency by resolution, I think it would be good to have a resolution. It also helps, I know, the clerk with all the record keeping, and it's easier to find if you have an actual resolution. So we could do it either way. I have a handwritten here motion if you really want to do it tonight, but I'd recommend you do it on the 12th. We'll have a resolution before you to make it. And if October 1st is the date you want to make it effective, we could certainly do that.
So what do folks want to do?
How would we address zoning? Or I guess I'm in full agreement on the concept of emergency and meeting in person, full stop. But then how do we address the zoning and the small businesses? That's my question for staff, number 2. And then just another plug to keep it on our legislative agenda. So when people come back and say, oh, I really liked that, well, then come help us lobby. This is important, and it's something we can continue to work on at the state level. So those are my 3 comments.
So the direct answer is that when the declaration is lifted, it starts that 6-month clock. And so we have 6 months to work through a zoning text change to affect the change that the council wants to make. That's the direct answer to that question.
I'm going to toss in my thoughts about the zoning changes, because I do think that there are going to be important considerations. You can probably find a simple way to do something for an interim change, but ultimately you'll need to be looking at what's happening to parking, do your parking requirements for restaurant uses and entertainment uses and all that. How much are those changing, and how does that affect sort of the general parking load in the city when there are not so many parking spaces and you're back to full capacity, and but all the parking spaces are now taken up with these outdoor tables or something. So it's just, I think, you may find a simple way to address it, but I do think there's some thinking that really needs to go on, and that would be during the 6-month period as to what effect you're going to have when you have all these new rules in the city, because there'll be big changes.
And sorry.
And we are thinking about it now, and so I think we can give maybe a clearer set of options on the 12th for the council to react to, and then we go from there.
Okay.
I appreciate the recommendation, Carol, that you have to do it by resolution. I would be okay with that, and it gives you, Mr. Shields, the opportunity to really trickle this down to staff to say, this is it. We need to you can get the word out to start planning, right? And gives us a little more runway.
As Ms. Heath said, we have been planning for this. We've been getting the word out to staff. This is coming, and so we'll just finalize it. I think this has been clarifying this discussion tonight, and we can now give more formal direction to staff. Here's what's going to be happening.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate having the direction.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Do we have any other items in the work session? Okay. Business not on the agenda. Standing Regional Committee and Council Liaison reports from anyone? Final council member comments.
Ms. Vice Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Duncan.
Just one. At the EDC meeting last week, there were a number of things discussed. Some of you were in on the call, so you already know those. I won't repeat them. One thing I did want to bring attention to and make sure that we keep on it during recess is the situation with the Famille and their special exception, apparent non-compliance with special exception on operating a restaurant there as was required when we approved the project. Staff said that the letters have been written, and anyway, wheels are turning to engage the folks at the Kensington in a dialogue on trying to get that location into compliance. And also, I don't have any information, but festive lighting is something that staff is working on, and they expect to bring to us in September for the street lights on the trees. That's all.
Anyone else? I just had 2 quick things. I had proposed that we cancel our August office hours, given that we're in recess. I did not hear any objections to that, so we will proceed with that.
Agreed.
And then the second item, I know the mayor's not here, but I think we have our mayor's meetings canceled until September?
Correct, until the week before the September 12th meeting.
So 9/7 will be the first Wednesday when we're back?
Correct.
Okay. So everyone's got that on the calendar. Okay. No minutes tonight either, right? Okay, then I think we're done. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And we are adjourned.